The past investigated. Welcome to the Historical Detective Agency, your stop for journeying back in time to examine history as an investigator would. The past investigated. Welcome to the Historical Detective.
See if this goes through this time. So, welcome to the Detective Lounge here at the Historical Detective Agency. It is April 23rd, 2026, and we are on the Pacific Coast right now. So, it's about 4:17 p.m. on the Pacific Coast time. We will be more mobile coming up just due to my other job. So, depending on when that works out, might be a new time frame where we'll be coming live for the Detective Lounge, and also some new guests that might be coming on. We've had Sargis and Gari, Michael Leon in the past. Michael Leon will probably have on again along with Sargis. And then we're trying to bring in some other folks so that we can get some international views in here. So one of the really good ones down in Panama is a good private investigator down there, Brett Michelson. And he's got a fascinating history about the investigations down there in not just Panama, but the Central and a little bit in South America over the last about 30 years. He was there for Operation Just Cause and the invasion of Panama, and I believe it was 89, 90, and stayed. Basically kind of went native, so to speak, but runs a really good investigation firm down there and has just a lot of information about that region and how both the operations down there go historically, as well as the relationships between nations over the last few years, few decades actually. So it's actually pretty interesting to see in some of his investigations as far as things that operate transnationally that most people don't see or don't hear about, but that are important. So we'll try to get him back on again. We did an interview with him earlier for a different channel. It was the Near East Center for Strategic Engagement when I talked to him when I was down there. Might be able to do that again. Also, it looks like we might be going to Thailand again. As everyone knows me, I was in Thailand off and on from 2007 after the first deployment to probably 2019, actually, off and on. So roughly maybe 6 to 7 years in Thailand, total contact time, and really got into the history in the last probably 4 or 5 years, just really delved into the history down there. And it's absolutely fascinating. And it's in the news again, oddly in a place where I caught dengue fever down in the Craw Isthmus. And I'm going to tell the story. Who cares? So this is probably it was the second deployment after I came back from the Middle East and I went to Thailand. And it was 2012. Yeah, 2011, end of 2011, early 2012. I was walking around in the Kra Isthmus trying to find the routes that a lot of the Rohingya were coming through Burma into Thailand, and then they'd go into southern Thailand around Hat Yai and then south in 3 provinces in southern Thailand. And there was a lot of worry that because the Rohingya are a Muslim minority in Burma, and that the violence in the Arakan region that they were going under, it was kind of an ethnic cleansing in that region caused by the CCP. The Chinese were actually influencing General Liang, who was a Burmese general, to ethnically cleanse the area because the Chinese wanted to build a pipeline from a port in the Arakan region all up through to China so that they could bypass the Straits of Malacca. Sound familiar? What's going on right now, the Straits of Malacca. And so this was causing a huge population shift, and Rohingya, who are Islamic, were moving into southern Thailand. Now, southern Thailand, since about 2003, had been experiencing a very intensive IED campaign. Almost no one knows about it. And that's primarily why I was there, is to talk to the Thais and just share information with the Thais about what was their campaign, what did we see in Iraq and the Middle East. Okay, compare notes, and what was similar, what was dissimilar, and that kind of thing, to see if there's any crosstalk between their insurgents and our insurgents. So that was primarily it, and then to basically assist them in just what's basic safety response protocols, things like that. The Thais were actually very good at what they did with no equipment. At the time I was there first time, no robots, no jammers, no portable X-rays. I mean, it was really, really old school, and they were really good at what they could do with what they had. So it was a learning experience for Americans. I try to get American EOD over there as much as possible so they could learn from the Thais, the old hook and line techniques and things like that, the old school ways, in case your equipment breaks down or you're in a situation where you can't use that equipment. What do you do? And so it was really a good exchange between the Thais, both their police and their military, and then their security forces, and then ours. It was very good. But part of that was trying to figure out this network. And so I was on the border in a place just outside of Laon, Thailand, just north of Ranong, between Ranong and Chumpon. And it was on the border. And I was trying to find these little nodes where they were coming through, because that is the stone's throw, literally, of the border, right, between Burma and Thailand. So I was trying to think, well, maybe there's something down here. And while I was there in the mangrove swamps, the I just kind of got really, really, really sick. I mean, it was pain. I was like, what is going on? And I kind of woke up in a hospital of course, in the Thai side, luckily in the Thai side. And, the Thais are looking at me, and it was remote. It was a Western hospital, not like the tourist areas or Bangkok where there's some, first class foreign hospitals or first class private hospitals. It was nice, but it wasn't, five stars by any means. And the staff is staring at me, and I'm like, and the doctor spoke a little, some broken English. And he was telling me, you have dengue, and literally it was like this, you have dengue, very sick, caused by Burmese mosquito. So they were very clear that this was a Burmese mosquito that gave me dengue, not a Thai mosquito. So, okay. So to this day, a Burmese mosquito gave me dengue fever. And so that led to staying a little longer in that region. I was able to kind of become friends with a good family down there, a really nice family, and they have extensive holdings. They have rubber tree plantations, shrimp farms, construction company, travel company, all that. And so I got very familiar with that area, and I realized that there was an old Japanese railroad that went there. So most people know about the bridge over the River Kwai, the famous Mae Hong Song up there in north, where the Australian, British, Dutch, and some American POWs were used to create a railroad, right, from Thailand to Burma. And they're very familiar with that, but they're not familiar with another railroad that was made in southern or south of Thailand. So if you think of Thailand as this elephant, down the trunk, about halfway down the trunk, at the thinnest part of that peninsula, that is the area we're talking about. And the Chumphon is on the eastern coast, and Laon and Ranong are on the western coast. And then Burma's right there, abutting it on the western coast. And you have a big city of Victoria on the Burmese side, which was British occupied at the time. And they would move from there. So what this was designed to take that railroad that went from Chumphon and just go basically across the peninsula down to Laon. And then they would ferry some equipment down to Ranong. But it was designed, we did the research, because it was just the shell, the ghost, I would say, of that railroad was still there. You could see the mounds, and the locals talked about it. And they were interested in it, but they didn't understand it. They said there's a mass grave of Indians there. And it was like, really? So we started digging into this, doing a historical investigation at the time, because it was we're knowing the locals better. We're getting the history of this place. They had M42 incendiary device ordnance that was dropped in World War II. They had it in their city hall. It's like, oh, okay. It didn't go off. It's still pyrophoric. So we were able to kind of get all this information. And what we did over the course of probably a few months is we walked that trail, and we found new spots. So they knew a few of the spots where the railroad had been built, but we found more. And then we went back through the history of the Thais that were there, and what was their history. We met some of the people that actually worked with the Japanese on that. Some of them were kids at the time. One lady was very old, but most of them had been kids at the time or young adults. And a lot of the histories of that region come from memories of that railroad, because after the railroad was built, the cities and the villages around it grew up because it increased trade. So for a brief moment in time, there was a lot more trade. There was a lot more revenue coming in. People were coming down, and that increased that area. In fact, the city of Laon itself, it's built on the railroad. You can see the modern street now, and then we went back to the World War II bombing photo that was there, because the British bombed the area and the U.S. had some bombing missions there. But they had a photo of Laon coming in to do the bombing of it, as that was the southern terminal of the railroad that the Japanese had built. And literally the switchback that they have, that little Y and the switch where you kind of move the railroad engine around, because you can't just turn them on a dime, and there was no roundabout. So they have this little area where they would do that, and then they would shunt the cars off to the port where the river comes up, and then they were able to do that. They just built the city literally on the railroad line. You could see it clear as day. And that basically, the railroad depot formed the new city. It had been a small village before, but now it was a city with the lines, the main street and everything built on those railroad lines. The museum to the Pacific War was across the street, where the old shunting engineering area was. So it was fascinating to see these ghosts, these echoes, the skeleton, if you will, being built upon in a vibrant community now down there. And the thing with the Indians was actually, this was built by the 6th Regiment, the same group that had built up north. A company had come down to build this one, the same ones that had built the bridge over the River Kwai up north. They sent a detachment, a company down. I think it was, I forgot which company, but it comes down. We actually met people from the 6th and the 9th Railroad Regiments, veterans at Yasukuni over in Japan, talked to them and got some information, but they hadn't gone down south. We could never meet anybody. I think they'd all passed away, all the Japanese that had been involved in the southern operation. But it was designed to get the Indian National Army, who was on the Japanese side, to or align with the Japanese, because they wanted to free Britain. They wanted to free India from Britain, and it was designed to get them down to Victoria Point and then across, so they could come up the southern area. So there was the northern route. So while that was getting built, they thought they could build this real quick and start moving in the Indian National Army in the southern area of Burma to be able to kind of solidify that, then move up and go in there. And so that was part of the idea. So the graves, we found out, was actually those. There was just a lot down there. I got dengue, right? If there wasn't medical treatment, I may have died. So there's just a lot of disease that goes on in the tropical environment. And those were both the laborers with the INA and then the INA soldiers that were down there garrisoning that area. They also did anti-aircraft duties and things like that. There were some Indonesians that were there from PETA that did anti-aircraft duty, and we saw some of their positions. And so those graves were actually from soldiers from either a few Indonesians, not many, I think it was like 8, and then a whole bunch of Indians, like 23 that had died. But the stories, become, because they blend in all these different narratives, they believe that it was from the forced labor, and it wasn't. Right? It was literally, they were volunteering because they wanted the Japanese to kind of get them into Burma to get into the fight. So that was very interesting down there. But the Kra Isthmus, why I'm talking about this, is that isthmus, the part of the family that I was with, they have land holdings, and the government was wanting to do a railroad, high-speed railroad there. While I was there, they built and this was 2014-15, they built a deep water port on the Andaman Seaside. So that's on the west side. And they were, it didn't make any sense. I'm like, why? In the middle of nowhere in the jungle, and they're building this. Okay, why? Because the railroad's gone. Right after the war, the British came and ripped up the railroad and moved it back down to either Malaysia, back to their territory, or they handed it off to the Dutch to go rebuild the Indonesian or the Dutch railroads in Indonesia. So the railroad was torn up, right after the war, and it didn't make any sense. And then at the time, they hadn't quite built the highway coming all the way down from Chumpon to Laon. So it's mountain roads. It was pretty dangerous because the fish oil would come out of the back of fishing trucks, and, you would be skidding along in the middle of the night if it rained. It just wasn't easy. So a deep water port didn't make sense at the time. However, now we realize that with the Straits of Malacca now being metered by Indonesia with that agreement with the United States, China, where are they going to go? Remember, I talked earlier about General Haliang in Burma had depopulated the Arakan region of the Rohingya because they wanted to guard the pipeline of the deep water port with the oil. And then they ran into Thailand. Well, that is necessary for them because they need to clear that area. That's a solid choke point now, the Straits of Malacca, and for hundreds of years, different groups have looked at that very spot where I got malaria, or excuse me, dengue, in Ranong, just south of Ranong, Laun, or north of Ranong, Laun. That area, they want to build a canal, right? So think all the history that we've talked about with the Panama Canal and everything that went on, the almost wars, the creation of a new country called Panama, all of that to create Panama. The Suez, right? With all of the things that the British did for the Suez, including creation of another nation, Israel, to get the Suez, occupied. What sort of seismic shifts are we going to see in Thailand, potentially in Southeast Asia, because it's right by Burma? I mean, it abuts right onto Burma, for getting that canal built and then securing that canal and the routes in and out of the canal if they build it there in Kra, the Kra Isthmus, right south of Laun, north of Ranong. So that's kind of interesting. So I might be going, it's a long story to say why I might be back in Thailand a little bit, looking at those things kind of real time and, what's going on, who's who in the zoo, what are the patterns and those things. And I'll love it because there's so much history that I still would love to get into with Thailand. It was absolutely an underdeveloped historical record that was there. It's in their language, but it's not in English. And the problem is when a few writers do translate it and bring it out into English, but when they do, it has a severe bias. It's never ever told from the Thai point of view. If you go over to our website and then our older archives here on Substack, you'll see I write about Thailand a little bit, and how the voices of Thais need to just come out. Just say the voices of Thai in their history as the first step, then you can interpret it. But basically, that's not done. So most of everything you read about Thailand is heavily politicized, and the ancient lines of politics still exist in families, and they're still at play today. So you can't write about, for example, the Rama dynasty without running into political minefields. So a lot of people will steer clear. Even today, even if you're writing about Rama III and his group, Rama V and his reforms that happened, everything. And then World War II is very testy because a lot of people I met them are still alive, or they're the children of those people that were in there. And I met the son of the first, or technically the second, but really the first prime minister, Payapahoa of Thailand. And I met also the grandson, and then almost met the mother or the daughter, his mother, of the longest serving Thai president, which was Pibun Songkram. And he was through before World War II, through World War II. The U.S. wanted to go after him, but the Thais are like, "Oh heck no!" So we were like, "Okay, fine." And then he became prime minister again. And then there was a coup with Sarit in the 50s during the Cold War, kind of the mid to late 50s. He ended up in Japan, just outside of Camp Zama, and that's where he lived with his kids, and then passed away. And then I helped the family find where his house was. They found the temple. So they were able to get his memorial tablet, and then with the guy I was talking with, his mother, and things like that. And his children his son, the one I was talking to, had actually been the longest serving Thai ambassador to the United States. So, like I said, those lines, even though you may be talking about history, they're still very involved today in politics. They're still ambassadors. They're still, members of the royal court. So still very much at play. And then occasionally they'll be at odds. So they've kind of staked their positions that are more based upon their family than on real ideology, which is kind of interesting. And that ideology was just to align with the foreign power. So whatever the foreign power's ideology was, that's what they would adopt, at least in form, in order to get the backing of that foreign power within Thailand. And they recognized they had to do that because Thailand was too small. So they said a fish that has to swim between two whales, had best have the ear of one of them. So that's kind of that. So just keep that in mind as we go forward here. Now, let's see. Let's go forward here. I'm going to do one thing. One thing we wanted to talk about was a problem. Let's see. Not really a problem, but we're going to go forward and we're going to talk about a couple things here. I've only got one camera because the other one's gone. That's the one that faces down. So rather than put my head on the table and come up, we're just going to draw into this. Before I went into this, somebody was asking me on another group chat, not the Substack one, about the fountain pens. Yes, I am a nerd for fountain pens. I do like fountain pens. I'm all over fountain pens. So I have a few, the Mont Blancs and things like that, the thin nubs. But this is what I was trying to tell them. It's Coeco. These are out of Germany. But when I travel, so if I'm here, and I want the nice fountain pen, the well balanced, I just need a balance when I'm writing because I write a lot in notes, and I like the well balanced one. But when I'm in the field, I take these are like my EDC for my note-taking kit. But I'll have another system called a Plowd, which is an AI recorder, and that's the voice notes. But for the actual notes themselves, and when I'm going through documents and things, once I've made copies of documents or my own notebook or thing, I'll just have these guys. And so if you know the note-taking for evidentiary look, you'll have different colors, right? So you have all your different colors. And there's even a highlighter fountain pen, which just made my day. Broad tip, again, Coeco, and then you've got the refills for that. So it's real nice because I can refill in the field really easy. And if I'm at home, I have the big ones. And then they're in here. But if I want to go portable with it, I just nail that on it, goes in the pocket, and then I'm gone. So I've got everything I need for, being able to kind of go out. And this just fits all in my little evidence bag. So I've got those. I've got the sticky notes for all the different colors for the different subjects, the who, the what, the when, the how, and the where. And then I've got these are actually just the little cartridges that you can put in the pens. I've ran out of Rand. I got to get those. But anyway, so somebody was asking me about that. And then if I have to go to anything formal that requires like a suit or something, then, these are the metal ones. So they're a little heavier, but the balance is phenomenal. I mean, I love the balance on these to be able to write. Thin point, you get the good balance, and it doesn't create that strain on your hand. So if you're doing lots of notes and you're writing a lot of information, to me, it's a lot better. It's a lot smoother than the ballpoint pen, and you don't have the quality control problems. And for me, it's economical because I can refill these either with a cartridge in the field, or I've got the little. There's a special plastic one that I can literally draw it out of an inkwell and then put it back in here. So these are the ones I kind of like. So somebody was asking me, just in case anyone's interested, there's that. So the fountain pen mania. All right. So I did want to show this. There was a comment that was made on one of our articles that came up, and here we go. So I'll go ahead and start that up. There we go. So the other day we wrote an article about what most people thought, which was was Trump versus the Pope. And we were like, no. There was an argument before that. And it was between Pope Benedict XV and Woodrow Wilson. And it was to us, it was fascinating. So we started digging into that. And if you haven't read the article, I definitely, toot my own horn here, but yeah, go see it. Cause it was interesting to me because I had not realized that this had occurred before. We were just going to look at, where the tensions between, American politics and, say the Vatican, where did that kind of start, considering that it was a very warm relationship with Pope John Paul II and Ronald Reagan. And so we're like, okay, where did the tension kind of start? Was it with the Trump administration? Was it before that? And it turns out it was a long time before that. So I was like, oh, okay. And there was literally a very spicy letter from Woodrow Wilson over to Pope Benedict XV. So it was very, very fascinating to read about that. Nothing new under the sun, and basically the same thing, because the Vatican was saying, as a moral cause, why don't we stop the war? Because we don't see this as a just war, and stop it, right? And then they kind of took Wilson for that, and then Wilson had a very spicy letter. There's a lot of source docs in here. You can kind of click it. There's the hyperlinks in there. You can click it and read the actual letter that was written to judge for yourself. But it was basically, he was in a sense telling the Pope, be quiet, sit down, stern facts over your morality. But those stern facts are millions of people died, and then for what, right? It's like, but again, and it was funny, and then it shows part of Wilson's 14 points, of course, came from some of the things that Trotsky had done. And then some of them, though, came from the Pope. So we're always taught that, at least some people are taught, that Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, either you had been taught that the 14 points were all original to Wilson, which is not true, or you learned that he was mirroring or trying to create an alternative to the Bolshevik points of self-determination, and each group should vote for its own governments, which wasn't true. It was just euphemism. But he was countering that propaganda. And so sometimes you're taught that yes, okay, there's some things that he copied off of the Bolshevik ideas. But what I did not know was that a lot of it actually was a lot of the substance. In fact, the Pope had 7 distinct bullet points about the peace, right? What's a good and just and lasting peace? And what the Pope put in there, which is down here, on August, right? So Benedict issued this, and he says, look, and pretty much it's self-determination. It's, get out of Belgium, get out of the occupied areas in the East, because pretty much Russia was on the ropes, and a lot of the areas were now occupied by the Germans. And then the Germans were okay with it. Depending on who you ask at what time, there was a moment where there was a sweet spot where Germany, and even as late as 1917, was going, okay, fine, we'll go with these if the U.S. and the Allies and Britain and all that go with it. But it didn't work. But anyway, he had 7 of these. Wilson put 14 and mirrored a lot of the things that the Pope had said. So he rejects the peace, but then he incorporates about 7 of the things that the Pope wanted. Now, the punchline of this whole thing is that what we see is that this is it doesn't make sense, right? In other words, if your motive, and we didn't really go into the article, but if the motive is basically to enact what you say. So Wilson went to war based on, safety and the freedom of the seas, and a war for civilization and democracy, right? And we have to have peace. And the Pope comes, okay, well, there's peace. That'll give you the safety and the freedom of the seas. And the Germans are saying they'll pull out of all that territory. And Wilson went, yeah, no. So in other words, it meant Wilson's just bluffing, right? Wilson has another agenda in mind, as did the British, who rejected a similar offer in 1915. So just a few months into the war, Germany and Austro-Hungary were already like, hey, dude, this is ridiculous. Let's cut this out. And the Vatican had gone to the United Kingdom. And at that point, the United Kingdom not just said no, but it went up into so much so that it told the other Entente members of the other their allies, don't talk to the Vatican. Right? There was actually a treaty that said you're not going to talk to the Vatican, and they made France and Russia, and they said do this. Now, the interesting part was once the Bolsheviks took over, they're very evil, they're very bad. Bolsheviks were just violent and cruel. But one of the things that they did that was a net good, one of the not intentionally, but just to save themselves, is they posted all of the secret treaties that the Tsar had with the West, and mostly Britain. And so people saw the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which said that this war was really about grabbing terrain and grabbing territory and grabbing routes and resources. That's what it was, because they were already doing deals with other nations about what they're going to do to carve up which nation, right? So mostly the Ottoman Empire. And so when people saw that, suddenly, Britain had to react. And actually, Britain did react a little bit with another offer that was incorporated in the 14 points, but it was in a response to they got caught. It was a response to there it is. So the rhetoric over reality is something that's very interesting, and you get a little taste of it in this article regarding the peace. In other words, okay, so Wilson, if peace is what you're saying and this is what you want, look, here's a way you can get it. And Wilson is like, no, I want peace on my terms, which means a League of Nations, which means a Bank of International Settlement, which means Germany's reduced to almost nothing, right? And the Pope rightly saw that the terms that they were going to suggest at Versailles were so harsh that it would lead to more suffering and war, and it did. So in this case, Woodrow Wilson, the vaunted statesman, had no idea what the second and third order effects were going to be, or maybe he did, and it was bad. So either way, intentionally he was bad, or unintentionally he was just not as smart, believe it or not, as the Pope was at the time, as far as what were the effects of this going to be. But I'd recommend go look at that. That's a starting point. We're going to do another one later about rhetoric versus reality on the war goals. We talked a little bit about that in the is this the third phase of a longer war, or is this World War III? And you can see it even in today's war, that the rhetoric doesn't match the reality. But that's only if you understand the reality to be what they're saying, right? But once you understand that war is economic and there's a lot of routes and resources that need to go in there, ideology is just the camouflage, the smokescreen, and the motivating factor to get the masses to kind of follow that. Then it comes into sharp focus. There's really no difference between the goals of World War I, World War II, and this now potentially World War III. The same forces, the same mechanisms are at play. And it was on that kind of topic that one of the commenters on here made a comment that is really the reason I'm kind of putting up this, because it was either a long kind of a response to him, or just do this. So I figure I'm going to do this, and we can take each of these in turn. So, and I've seen this a lot. This is a comment that was made about 3 days ago, and I've seen this same thread go through. In fact, when we were looking at monitoring a lot of the sites, different social media sites for radicalization and that sort of thing, we picked up on a lot of trends. But one of the things that's interesting is a lot of what's in here. Now, I don't know if he is, a government contractor. I don't know if he is, who he is. He may come by this honestly, his opinions on this or his theory. He may come by it honestly. He may have researched it and seen it. But I have seen very similar allegations made or similar information operations made with using the same talking points by government agencies, right? By contractors mostly. And it's funny because, I was literally getting flack for this, I don't know, a year ago when we were monitoring, we're having fun on Gab because we're like, no, Hitler was gay, right? There he is. He was arrested for homosexual prostitution in Austria, in Vienna in 1909. So there you go. And people lost their mind. It was 2 years ago, actually. It was when there was a lot of push for LGBTQ, and they were saying that the Nazis were against it. It was like, well, no, Hitler and a lot of his guys were gay. They only knocked out one homosexual advocacy group, the Berlin Sexual Institute, but they left the other one in, right? There was another organization that was promoting scientific views of homosexualities, but it was more of the butch dominance, the Spartan way. And it lasted, and we have records of that until 1943, right? So it wasn't he was against homosexuality. It was a specific idea of homosexuality as feminine. It was the male wishing to be feminine rather than the male dominating. It was a means of domination, which fit in with the Nazi ideology. So we were doing that on GAD. We were pointing that out, that no, opposing forced gender transitioning in children does not mean you're a Nazi, right? it's a false thing. And all of a sudden the IPs were pinging. We're like, wait a minute. And half of them are in Virginia, and they were contractors. And we're like, and then there was somebody that gave us a PowerPoint, and they were a contractor, and they're like, this is ridiculous. They were supposed to be, looking for, again, online hate. But they were under contract, and what that was, they were had the talking points. So in other words, here's their PowerPoint. This is what they're supposed to do, and it matched what we said. In fact, we had said, this sounds like it's talking points. You need a better handler to give you better talking points. And that's when this person said, yeah, you're right. Here you go. And then they contacted us around about and said, yeah, here you go. So, and it's funny because just yesterday, and I tell that to people, and they're like, oh, no way. But I told it to a bunch of people. But yesterday, somebody called me up and said, hey, guess what? The Southern Poverty Law Center has been indicted for fomenting, literally creating the problem they say that they're going to do, right? They're the arsons, and then they come in with the fire brigade. I said, yeah, I've told you. So there's a lot of that going around where you create the illusion of this sort of thing. And a lot of the other ones they'll create false straw men, right? They'll create straw men, and they say, oh, here it is, and that distracts you, right? So you're all busy attacking one thing, but it's to divert your attention from what the actual, problem is. So that sort of thing. So what we're going to do is, and again, I don't know if this commenter is part of that group. The language is a little bit different, but the talking points are roughly the same. But like I said, it may be, comes by it honestly, but I've definitely seen this as part of a prepackaged kind of a propaganda campaign that goes out there. And it's designed two things. One is the honey trap, everybody, glomps onto it, they hit like, and then their name is on that database and all that sort of thing. The other one is it's just designed to divert, right? Don't look over here, look over here. So, but either way, a lot of the facts don't bear up to scrutiny. And that's what I wanted to go over today, because it is easy to kind of go down the rabbit hole and get stuck if you don't look at things in a certain way. So we'll go over basically what the comment was, and then his response to it, which really we're going to get into today. And then we'll kind of dive into them and say, okay, does that hold up? Right? We'll examine it. We'll look at it. We'll look at the evidence. Say, okay, does it hold up? Yes or no? And then if anybody has any additional evidence like we didn't see or missed, bring it in there, because it's all about evidence, right? Put the evidence forward. Let's look at it. Let's analyze it on an evidence-based approach, not an emotional-based approach. And then assign, okay, means, motive, opportunity. You have to have the means and the motive and the opportunity, right? Otherwise, it's just opinion. We don't have a case. So that's what we're gonna do. So we're gonna go through this real quick here. And again, 3 days ago, so I had he was saying that Wilson was a puppet, much like Trump, because Wilson, he says, did not accept the peace from the Pope because he was a puppet. Well, that's true. And his handler was a guy named Edwin House, or Colonel House. He was a Kentucky colonel. He wasn't a real colonel. And he had managed to pretty much groom Wilson into the White House, right? He selected Wilson and said, this is our guy. And it was between Wilson and Teddy Roosevelt, interestingly. And then Teddy Roosevelt went off and formed basically the Progressive Party, the Bull Moose Party. Split from the Republicans against his former friend and Vice President Taft. And everyone says it's different, but if you look at the beginning of the progressive parties, the Bull Moose Party's platform for the first term, it almost exactly matches Wilson and Wilson's kind of fascistic ideas, right? And so statist ideas. And so, and House mentions both of them, right? House actually wrote a novel. It was a realistic novel. And it was basically his political ideals couched in fictional names, but if you read it, it's literally his blueprint about how you create governments and presidencies and form those sorts of things, his utopian vision, if you will. And it's called, so anyway, it's the Vision of Tomorrow. It's the administrator, Philip Drew, administrator, A Vision of Tomorrow. And he wrote this as kind of a future utopia, but it's his blueprint. And one of the things is that the people shouldn't choose. It should be a government run by experts, right? Which is basically what we have now. But he's the one that talked about there's a great teacher who would be good as a leader. There's a great teacher that we could have, which is Wilson, or the great man who has built canals and dams and things like that, and that's Roosevelt. So he mentions both of those as potentially the right person in there. And so eventually he picks Wilson. He grooms Wilson. He meets him in a hotel, judges him, and says, yep, this is our guy. This is our puppet. And they managed to put Roosevelt in the election at the same time. So Wilson, of course, is elected president. And we'll go into that in a little bit. But yeah, absolutely. Wilson, there's no doubt about that. Wilson was a puppet, much like Trump was. And we know this even more because during the last 2 years of his presidency, he had a stroke. And House ran the White House for a little while. And then Edith Wilson, President Wilson's wife, technically was the first U.S. female president because she was running that while he was down. They never handed it off to the vice president like the Constitution says. They were running it. Her and the physician for Wilson were essentially running the country from the president's house while Wilson was stroked out in the White House. So not stroked out like Clinton, had a stroke. So Wilson was not allowed to disengage anymore with the British, French, or Germans. Now, if you read Wilson, he was engaged. So he didn't want to, right? So there's a difference between being a willing puppet, and then you just can't do anything on your own. Wilson was engaged and invested in creating this order. If you read his book before he became president called The State, he is all about centralization of power. He's very much a statist, right? What we call, it's kind of a controlled socialist, or definitely fascist, and I would argue proto-communist. But he looked at this vision for the globe. He wanted this in the whole world, right? He was very much an Anglophile in an age that was still Anglophobic. And he wanted to mimic this kind of elite running system that was also global. He wanted to tie in the U.S. to a global system. That's why he had the League of Nations. That's why he had agreed to move into World War I, is he wanted this in there. He wanted to stitch the U.S. financial system in with the European financial system, mostly with London as kind of a control mechanism. But it would run that blood flow would be through a number of other nations, mostly Europe. So that was Wilson. So it wasn't the fact that he wasn't allowed. He wanted to disengage. He was all in this. He just needed the room to maneuver. He was hoping to get by with just investing, giving war loans, and being able to provide munitions and things like horses and agricultural products to England, and not have to commit any troops, right? Or maybe some naval assets, but not commit troops. The war went so badly for the British. Their plan of this was over by Christmas, by the big pincer of the Russians coming down from the north, the French moving up through Belgium in the south, and then the British doing the blockade. That fell apart, right? They realized that Germany punched above its weight, and they were hard pressed. So I would disagree with him that he was not allowed to disengage more than the British, French, or Germans. This was the British plan. The British had been planning this since about 1890. If you look at Cecil Rhodes and Alfred Milner, they were very much setting the scene from even before the Boer War. The Boer War was a stage for it, and then they were looking to the next phase of operations. And don't forget, Cecil Rhodes openly wrote that, his foundation that he was setting up, his bazillions of dollars, and his network that he was building, that eventually Alfred Milner took over, he was all about putting that everything into it, like, Elon Musk level money at the time, and a lot more power than Elon Musk has in the government, to say, look, I want Germany to be reduced. I want the U.S. to come back in what he called the British family. And there it is. That was literally what it was. And then to promote, as he said, Anglo-Saxon culture all over the world. That was Cecil Rhodes. And then Alfred Milner took over. So we have the Rhodes Scholarship to get Americans, elites over there. There was a lot of Oxford trips. There was the Pilgrim Society, the Round Table Society, a number of, the clubs that were set up to kind of groom and court American elite or future American elite, so that they would now have good feelings toward the British, that they would be aligned with the British, and they would kind of move those networks together and enmesh those two systems together. It's never just some guy coming in, yelling at you, pointing a finger, or waving a magic wand. It's a process of being able to enmesh two systems together, right? So any large organization that, for example, the Cecil Rhodes, Alfred Milner was huge because they're utilizing the British system, especially once Queen Victoria died. to be able to get Germany. And they had tried the first couple of wars in 1909, 1910. Germany didn't bite because it was straight up against Germany. They only bit in 1914 when the Archduke Ferdinand, who was an Austro-Hungarian duke, was assassinated. And because of the treaties, they said, we got him. So they mobilized Russia. They began to put the strain on there. It was probably Lord Grey that actually wrote the Serbian reply to the Austro-Hungarian request that they investigate it, and they want the people responsible for the assassination brought to justice. Looks like Lord Grey's handwriting or linguistic style. So they're maneuvering it, and they got their wish finally. But they had thought this would be over. So there's a genius plan they'd been planning years for, and it didn't work, right? The Russians very soon collapsed after Tannenberg or the Masurian Lakes, depending which one you want to call it. And they were already back. They were hightailing it into Warsaw in no time. They were retreating, right? And so they were almost out. And the British were just in pain. And that's why the Americans had to come in, because they's like, well, we got to protect our investment. We're going to have to back up the British. And then we kind of reversed it. And then the British ended up owing us money. So that was quite interesting. So it's not so much Wilson wasn't allowed or that the British wanted out. The country in here that actually wanted out were the French. They at times were ready to negotiate or go out, and it was the French people that were technically rebelling. There was a number of strikes, if you want to call it, or sit-ins on the front lines. And then the Russians definitely wanted to. He doesn't have the Russians up here, but the Russians wanted to get out. The Germans actually were talking to the Vatican and saying, look, can you negotiate a deal? Because Britain's not replying to us, right? And the Vatican did. And the British shut them out. Right. So the Germans were looking for peace. The French, were on the verge of collapse a couple times. The Russians were wanting out, but Tsar Nicholas actually wasn't allowed because the British group had this certain nodes within his cabinet. But we won't go too much into that. That's a rabbit hole right there. But we'll suffice to say, I disagree with this one. Wilson wanted in. Right. He didn't need his arm twisted. So we're going to keep going through here. We're going to jump forward a little bit. But what he does is basically he's saying all of this is the Jews. Right. And for some reason, he doesn't say the Jews. Right. He'll just say it. I mean, just say it. If you think it's the Hottentots, say it's the Hottentots. If you think it's the Jews, say it's the Jews. If you think it's the Christians, say it's the Christians. Right. If it's the Mormons, say it's the Mormons. Right. Cryptic. And he even says down here, it's like a cryptic reply. I reflected cryptically. Well, I'm an investigator, man. Don't, I have secret knowledge. No, say it. Say Jews. If you think it's Jews, tell me it's Jews, right? I interview people all the time. Just say it, right? Euphemisms don't work. Just tell me. And it's no ding on him. It's just, he tries to set a narrative tone in here, and it's like, just give me the facts. So what he's doing is he's saying, okay, it's the Jews. Because what he does here is he says it had to be kept the German army had to be kept at the front line so the Rosa Luxemburg crew could attempt a Bolshevik takeover over Germany as much as their cousins had previously accomplished in Russia and the future Soviet states. So what he's implying is that this was a Jewish-led revolution. Now, this is where he totally gets it wrong. And this is where the history becomes so important, because people do not understand the actual history of World War I, and especially from the German perspective in World War I, and even less so in the German-Jewish perspective from World War I. Now, we're going to get into this a little bit, but Germany had the highest participation rate of Jews of all the nations, right? So 16% participation rate, which is very high. Protestants, I think, were they at times would match it. Catholics were below it. So 16%, there was only 500,000 Jews in Germany. That's it. And so you're looking at about 250,000, roughly American or males. And even of that, everybody wasn't a fighting age and everyone didn't qualify. So 16% is very high. By comparison, America during its 2 years had a 6%, and then it was up to about a high of 7%. And that was the high mark of participation. France and Britain were both below about 3 or 4%, depending on the year. And that was it. Right. So Germany was 16% was huge. And it wasn't just the males going into service, volunteering into service, volunteering for frontline combat. A number of aces were German, a number of the medals for valor, like big ones, the House of Hohenzollerns with crossed swords, those were done by Jews in the infantry. So it wasn't an anomaly. They were volunteering, they were going forward. But the home front, the women of multiple different groups, Orthodox, Reform, both were very, very supportive of the war effort throughout the war. And that was the surprising part. It didn't waver, because to the Jews, Germany was the Jerusalem, right? In many Passover Seders, there's a toast you have at the end of the Passover Seder where you say, next year in Jerusalem. there was a lot of the satyrs for about 50 years in Germany had actually said next year in Berlin, right? Because it's like next year in Berlin. And even in some of the Jews in Poland, they had satyrs that would say next year in Berlin. And so Berlin was actually Germany had been a very a very conducive place for Jews to be able to integrate into modern society. And they were in Hamburg, for example, in 1910, 53% intermarriage rate. That's phenomenal. You don't have that even in New York today, right? This was very integrated. The personal banker of Kaiser Wilhelm II was Max Warburg, right? He was Jewish. He was a Jewish banker. He was not only Kaiser Wilhelm II's personal banker, he was the state banker, right? So he was effectively the Secretary of the Treasury of Imperial Germany. So they were all in. The Jews wanted Germany. If the Jewish opinion counted for what was going to win and not, Imperial Germany would have won, and America would never have entered the war if there was a Jewish conspiracy, if all the Jews were united, because the majority of the Jews outside of New York and Poland were there. Now, why were so many invested in World War I? A lot of them were invested because they were liberating the lands of the Jews from the Russian czars. And the Russian czars were there was many pogroms. There was a lot of issues with the Polish area. Just as the Poles had been mistreated by the Russians, the Jews in Poland were mistreated by the Russians. It came with it. So number one, you're in Poland, so you're going to get on the second tier, and then you're Jewish in Poland, so it's going to be the next tier even. So there was a lot of pogroms that went on. There was a lot of issues with that, and they were mostly kept in the shtetls. There wasn't room to move up. And so that was a big deal, is that they felt that they were liberating that area. In fact, there's an interesting sermon from one of the Reform synagogues, I believe it was in Frankfurt, that the Reform synagogue rabbi, and it was published in the paper, he literally compared Kaiser Wilhelm II to a new Moses. He's liberating everyone in the Pale, which was Poland and Russia, from the Tsar. And so it doesn't make any sense that the Germans had to be kept in the front, because the Germans, the Jews, the majority of Jews there, Rosa Luxemburg was not German, right? Rosa Luxemburg was a migrant that came in there. And oh, by the way, the two people that shot Rosa Luxemburg and beat her with the rifles were Jewish Freikorps members. They were veteran Freikorps members, right? So there were Freikorps units. There was a couple of commanders that didn't want Jews in there, but most of the Freikorps units were Jewish, or had Jewish members in there, in proportion to their service in the army and the infantry. So there's that. The first victim of communism, one of the first victims of communism in Germany was during the Bavarian communist uprising, where a group of communists took over Bavaria temporarily, and they began executing their hostages. And one of depending on the story you hear, either the second person or the third person or the first person shot was a Jewish art professor, right, who refused to go along with them, right? It's like, this is ridiculous. Some of the most virulent anti-communists in Germany were Jews. So that doesn't make sense. In other words, he's implying that, okay, it's some kind of Jewish thing because Rosa Luxemburg was Jewish. Yes, she was, but she wasn't German, right? And she wasn't part of that whole support network. And there were a lot more German Jews that were very supportive of Germany, demonstrably supportive of Germany, Imperial Germany, than there were against. And she was killed by two guys. And one of them said, she's a double traitor, not only to the land that gave her refuge, because she was a refugee, supposedly, but also to the Jewish race. That's what he said. So there you go. So that doesn't hold up under examination. And there's a lot more in there. We also have a two-part article. If you go over to our webpage, I don't think I put it on Substack yet. If you go over to historyda.org, we have a big two-part series about both the German Jews in World War I and their service, and then during the immediate interwar period, and how that changed. How did you go from hero to suddenly being a villain during that time? And we'll go into that a little bit here, but that's not true. The reason why the Germans signed the Bolshevik-backed and constructed armistice was because they had to put down a communist rebellion at home, not because they were losing at the front. Well, it's a combination of things. Number one, there was a number of different rebellions at home, and that they were starving, right? Because there was a food blockade that had been put in by the British. The Imperial Germans were not going to take all of the food out of Ukraine. At that point, they were occupying Ukraine. They were setting up an independent nation of Ukraine, as well as Poland, and they were thinking about Poland, and then they had Lithuania. So they were setting up these areas that they had beat the Russians out of, and they were setting up these independent nations there. And they had thought about mobilizing the Poles and just bringing in all the food like the Nazis did. But the Imperial Germans at that time were like, no, they need to eat. So the Germans at home were starving so they could maintain their possessions out and keep their soldiers fed and keep the civilians in the occupied areas fed as well. So just a tremendous logistical problem back in World War One. So much so that President Herbert Hoover has written a lot about it. He was with the International Red Cross trying to alleviate starving, famine conditions, as well as some disease that occurred in those areas. So go back in the Hoover Institution Library is a great one to go to, and you'll see the humanitarian crisis that was in that area, because the British had blockaded the food even after the armistice was signed and the war was on. Britain still wanted Germany to starve. They were after literally destroying Germany, period. That was the British. That wasn't the Jews, because the Jews were massive. They were suffering in there, right? The civilians were Jews, right? So 500,000 were suffering alongside the Germans, right? Because they were Germans, right? The German Jews were Germans. Get that through your head. All right. Same attempt was made by Bela Kun and their country, Eastern European. Okay. Coincidences? Yeah, actually. So, in other words, in the Communist Party, you have atheists, you have people that formerly were Jewish and formerly were Christian, and formerly there was even a Buddhist. There was a couple of Muslims in there. It doesn't, in other words, what's your case? You're trying to insinuate without actually saying it. You're going in a roundabout little inferential way that this is Jewish. And it's okay. There's no evidence so far that it is, right? Where's the motive? The motive isn't there. The motive is to keep Germany as powerful as it can, because the majority of the integrated Jews are in Germany. The rich Jews are in Germany, right? So the Warburg family's in Germany. Albert Bollin, the Hamburg American Shipping Line guy, he's in Germany, good friends with Kaiser Wilhelm II. And they're liberating all of the Jews that have been under the totalitarian state of the Tsarist Russians for a long time. So yeah. That doesn't make sense. Coincidences? Yeah, absolutely. Italy in there, Portugal, same twice. Okay. It doesn't mean Mexico, Christos War. Okay. That's a lot of Americans doing that, right? The Mexican Constitution was the first Bolshevik constitution, technically, and that was actually set up by the United States, right? So we were setting up Mexico as kind of a safe southern border using Bolshevik methods. And then the Cristeros War was the Bolshevism wanted to do away with religion, right? Much as Rockefeller wanted to do away with religion, except his version of it, which was kind of a bastardized Baptist maneuver. Wilson was a Presbyterian, right? And so he believed in all this crazy stuff. I mean, this literally makes no sense, right? If you look at what was the Cristeros War, is communism and statism, like much as even we're getting here in the United States, designs to move out morality from the realm of the religious and move it into the secular. Right. The argument between the Pope and the president, both in Woodrow Wilson's time and in President Trump's time, comes down to that. I will set the morals. You don't set the morals. Right. And it's the state versus the secular versus the divine. Right. As far as moral, right. Religion or secular, which one rules? And that's been a problem for a while. I mean, Germany before Kristallnacht and before Kaiser Wilhelm II, they were looking at destroying religion, but they were going after the Catholics. So look up Kulturkampf in Germany during Bismarck's time, before Kaiser Wilhelm II. So from roughly 1872 to about the 1880s when it went away, and Kaiser Wilhelm II pretty much put a kibosh on that. But it was going after the Catholics because it was religion setting the tone, right? Everything within the state. It's the French. The French went after the Catholics during the French Revolution. So this is an old system. It doesn't have anything to do with Judaism, because Judaism will end up being in the same boat, right? Even if they go after the Catholics first, the Jews will be second, like they were in Germany. Kulturkampf first, and then Kristallnacht, right? So kind of going down there is not proving anything. Mao's advisors they were Russians, right? They were Russians. In fact, his son was held hostage in Moscow. It didn't work because Mao didn't really give a crap about his son, but his biological son was in Moscow being held hostage by Stalin. Stalin was a what? Christian. Okay, so what? They don't want that known? So it doesn't have anything to do with it. Stalin doesn't do what he does because he at one time wanted to be a Christian. It doesn't hold water. So a lot of this is really falling apart. So let's keep going here. No one talks about the multiple attempts, in some cases, success, communist Bolsheviks all over the world. Yeah, we do. I mean, that's the communist expansionism. Okay. So why? Because those who control publishing houses. No. And this is only partially. He tries to say because the Jews own a large portion of the media in the United States, that therefore, in England, and therefore, this is why we don't hear about that. And actually, if you go into any college campus, you'll see that there are true believers in a socialist state, and they believe that communism is a reflection of the socialist utopian ideal that they had. But you see that in 1880s. I mean, Edward Bellamy, the Bellamy socialists, they set up utopian communes in the United States. New Llano, Louisiana, down there near Fort Polk. It was Fort Johnson for a little bit, but now it's Fort Polk again. That was New Llano was a communist commune in the United States long before anything with Judaism. It's a dream even in Christianity, to give it up. And the apostles, right? In the very beginning, if you read, I think what Paul was writing, I'm just now learning this, so correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, please. Paul was just writing about how they would give up their things and share it together with the apostles, right? They all kind of communed together and give this stuff there. So, it's not, the communist doesn't run into Judaism. Judaism actually is antithetical to communism if you're Jewish, right? Now, your parents may have been Jewish, but you're not observant. That means you're not Jewish. Jewish isn't a race or an ethnicity. That's the problem we've gotten into since Voltaire. And unfortunately, a lot of Jewish groups adopt that. Say if your mom's Jewish, you're Jewish. But there's nothing genetic that your mother gives you that makes you Jewish. Obama is not a white president, right? Tiger Woods isn't the best Thai golfer in the world. we don't look at it that way. But for some reason, we have this weird magic elf people imagination about Jews, thinking that, okay, that's a race or an ethnicity. It's not. In fact, most Jews are converts. We'll get into that in a minute. I'm getting on a tangent here. So the common thread, each country is sown in civil war rebellion. Here we go. So this is the interesting one. The same ones thrown out of at least 109 countries over the last 1 to 2 millennia who condemn the Son of God. Okay, so he's coming at it from a religious base. All right, interesting. And he mentions John down here. But let's take this one, because I've seen this one a lot. And some of the government contractors will put this out there to try to get people to like, oh, okay. If you were thrown out of 109 bars, well, there must be something wrong with you. All right, well, let's take a look at it. So the 109 countries doesn't really work, because some places are number one, if you're a historical guy, some places are kingdoms, some places are, they're provinces, countries is a modern thing, but let's just take it as an organized area. It doesn't add up, right? In other words, when you go through it, some of the expulsions are from a city, right? So for example, Rome never expelled the Jews from Judea. Never, right? And this is a myth that even the Jews have picked up. The Jews say we were kicked out of Judea. They'll say Israel sometimes, but it's Judea technically, right? It never happened, right? The exile or galut is a spiritual galut. It's a spiritual exile, but physically, Jews, except for the leaders of the Bar Kokhba revolt in around the 7th 70 AD time frame, those were kicked out and brought to Rome and executed. But for the hundreds of thousands of Jews that were in Judea, they stayed there unless they voluntarily moved out. But there was no expulsion order. It wasn't like Dacia that turned into Romania. It wasn't like Carthage where they wanted to wipe out an entire civilization. They made Jerusalem off limits to circumcised males for about 9 months while they reduced the temple to reduce the chance of an insurgency flaring up again. And then after the temple was down, they let the circumcised Jews back in. That's it, right? So that's one, but they'll put that on the list. So, and there's a bunch of others there. But let's use the same logic for the other metric, right? So, and I'm going to do a little experiment with you guys to show you how you can kind of deal with some of this when you see it, if you want to deal with it. But let's go over here. So I'm going to remove this real quick. All right, then we get to the camera here. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to go through this, and I'm going to show you just how bad this argument is. So number one, 109 countries you're kicked out of. Okay, well that could be good, that could be bad. Without context, we don't know. Right? Or you were thrown out of a bar. Was for why? Right? Being thrown out of somewhere doesn't necessarily make it bad, right? It's not a criminal record. It's just you got thrown out. And of a country, some people get expelled because they capture goods, right? The Knights Templar were wiped out and kicked out of France. Doesn't mean they did anything wrong. It's like they had a bunch of money that people wanted and they went after them, right? So, and that was a recurring theme in some of the areas, is because they would give loans because they were the only ones allowed to give loans, because under the Catholic doctrine, you cannot give a loan with interest, right? Legally. Now, kings did it. Christian kings would do it all the time, but they shouldn't do it, right? And they would run afoul of certain things. So, so in order to get communion, they would say, okay, I don't do a loan. And it was easier to use a middleman, right? That had international business connections, usually because of a common language like Yiddish or Ladino, and then B, the Talmud, which is a business manual, more or less. They already have a set of laws already built in there. They know what to expect, and they could go to a rabbinical court to have it settled, right? A debt, or this transaction didn't go this way, and it was a firm set of business laws. We have those now. We take those for granted globally today. International business regulations, right? International banking regulations, international airline regulations. But in the Middle Ages, they would vary from kingdom to kingdom unless you live within a solid empire. They would vary sometimes from town to town. So if you had a group of people that already had this connectivity and a little bit better chance of being able to get an issue resolved if there was a problem with transactions, you're going to use those guys as the middlemen. The Assyrian Christians in the Middle East, up in Middle East and Persia and Iraq area, those guys, Mesopotamia and up, they were used between the Sunnis and the Shia to be middlemen on commercial transactions. And over in, depending where you were, people would use Haqqanis or Fuqanis to be able to do the similar in Southeast Asia, right? So everywhere there's a group of people that can operate between adversarial groups or do things that are not seen as appropriate by kind of the ruling groups, and they usually would do those things, and that's what they do, right? Especially if they have the ability to be able to communicate and to judge problems in commercial transactions in a standard way, right? You know what to bet on. It's a safe bet. You're going to bet on that, right? And once they accumulated a number of money, especially if loans were given to kings and they were saying, hey, we're going to charge you some interest, well, I'm going to remove that debt. So 109 doesn't really mean much without context. It also isn't true. It's only about probably 20 to 30 when you break it down. But we're going to do the same thing, and I'll show you with the Christians, right? So you can do the same exercise with the Christians. It doesn't mean that the Christians are terrible, right? That's the funny part. So if you go into, there's Roman expulsions, all of this fun stuff that goes in there. The Mongols did it out. You're looking at approximately, right? So approximately equal numbers of both the Jews and the Christians were kicked out. So approximately, depending on what you look at, 50 nations Christians were kicked out of, right? Now, occasionally that was for proselytizing. For example, in Thailand, they went against certain groups. And it's actually more if you consider just Catholic groups in some cases, because France would use or was seen as using Catholics as missionaries for colonial purposes. Whether that's true or not is up to interpretation. But for example, in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, the Annamite Kingdom, Siam, actually Thailand, Piban Songkram, actually, like I said, I worked with his grandson, who was the longest serving ambassador to the United States. They were going against Catholic. They were banning Catholics from Thailand because they were seen as French colonial agents, right? So he particularly targeted them for persecution and to get them out. Also, if you look at internecine fighting, if you look at Catholicism, for example, during the Protestant Reformation and all of the wars that occurred after that, there were many nations that also kicked out Christians. They kicked out Catholics, right? So you kicked out Christians. That number would almost double depending on the time frame that you're looking at. So, that itself doesn't prove anything, right? So that's kind of the thing. So you're looking at about 48 to 40, well, between 30 to 50, depending when you're looking, Jewish groups, and between about 50 countries, kingdoms, etc., that the Christians were kicked out of. Right. So it's roughly equal between those. So does that prove anything? No, not at all. And again, that's kind of the issue, is that talking point shows up a lot in some of the government propaganda that comes out there. Like, oh, look, here you go. You're kicked out of countries. Therefore, there must be something wrong. Right. So we've already shown that there's that issue. Let's keep going on with this one real quick. And this is the kind of the funny one here. And I don't understand this one, but I do, but I don't. It says, and just wait until the world finds out that they, the Jews, I just say the Jews, dude, are actually Edomites who were forcibly converted in 125 BC by John Hyrcanus and then infiltrated and took over the Sanhedrin. And Herod the Great rose to power and murdered the Israelite members of it. Okay, that's the world. What do you mean the world finds out? The world knows this. I mean, this is, it's like, okay, what? So it's like it's some kind of secret thing here, right? But it's not, and we'll show you here in a second. So a couple of good books I would recommend for people to kind of look at. Where to go? So The Invention of the Jewish People by Shlomo Sands. I think we've talked about that before, and that's still down in the library. Of all the books I brought up, I forgot. Oh, here it is. Hold on a second. This guy, right? Get this book, okay? And he blows away some of the myths. Now, he's not religious, so you're not going to get, textual verses or comparisons between, the Torah and things like that. But what you will get is an excellent historical fact-based look at, okay, what is the development of a couple of things? So that there's a culture of Judea. There's the Judean kingdom, right, which is separate than Israel, right? Israel was separate. There is a lot of admixture in there. There's a lot of myths that we hold today that didn't exist at the time in Judea and the immediate post-temple period, and a lot of changes and evolution in the practicing and the observance and the understanding of the Jewish religion from the temple time through the Middle Ages, and then separations even within the Islamic controlled areas and the Christian controlled areas, right? And then there was a separation, a divergence, a convergence. There's still things there, but he goes into that, right? And it's in depth. And of course, right? I mean, that was a big deal, right? Even throughout all of those things. I mean, Solomon, right? King Solomon, the fabled King Solomon. Now, whether he existed or not, we don't know, right? There's no proof of Solomon, right? But even according to the textual sources in the Jewish textual sources, it says that he failed, right? He was idol worshiping. He had so many wives. He had so many kids all over the place, right? Completely failed. I mean, the story of Judea and Israel is one of failing to live up to the laws that they had set or had been given by God at Har Sinai or Mount Sinai. But he goes into it, and he has that, and he has more, right? Yeah, of course. That's why, for example, the in the Jewish Tanakh, right, or the Chumash, whichever you want to look at, which way we want to call it, the Torah, the Nevi'im, the Ketuvim, the Maccabees, the book of the Maccabees is not included. Now, the Jews lately have kind of gotten into Hanukkah, right, which is the Maccabees fighting against it, but that became more emphasized in two ways. One, as the Jews kind of competed with a more commercialized Christmas, they needed to, and the Jews and Christian kids went to school together. They needed some competing, celebration that you could have kids involved in that wasn't, that wasn't dragging their kids away to a Hanukkah bush, as they call it, the Christmas tree, right? You had to have some kind of counterpoint to the Christian celebrations for your kids, so the kids didn't feel left out. So you see Hanukkah over time become more emphasized than it is today, right? Just like Christmas was more emphasized today. It used to be a mass. You go to a midnight mass and you do this. Now there's a Santa Claus and there's a toys and stockings and all these things are like commercialized into Christmas. But it used to be a mass. You would go to a midnight mass. It was a prayerful event. Hanukkah is not a religious event. Hanukkah was like a 4th of July celebration, and it became more emphasized at different times with different groups. But the story of Hanukkah, the Maccabees book 1 and book 2 is not in the Jewish canon. Why? Because the Hasmonean dynasty is not seen as a good thing, right? They know it's bad, right? They're like, this is horrible. In fact, they even argue he's not Jewish. Now he's Jewish, but they argue he's not, right? Oh, he's a terrible person, so he must not be a Jew, right? So we don't want Maccabees in there. So he goes into that. Shlomo Sands goes in and breaks all that. So this isn't new. This isn't wait till the world finds out. The world knows. The world just doesn't want to read it, right? It's in there. A lot of things like Jews would proselytize. Most Jews all over the world are converts, right? So when everybody's like, it's again, it goes back to that whole the race thing. It's not, right? German Jews are a lot of them are descendant from Germans, right? From the Roman period, right? There are a lot of Greeks converted, right? So you had Armenians convert, and people would convert to Christianity, back to Judaism, and back, so much so that once the Romans took over, once Christianity took over the Roman Empire, became the official religion of the Roman Empire, I should say, under Emperor Constantine, there were 9 edicts to stop the Jews converting other people, right? First, it was just, you can't convert Christians. Then it was, you can't even convert pagans, right? And so they did that. And then once Islam took over most of the Christian lands, and then also to the Zoroastrian areas to the east, eventually they did the same, right? Because Judaism was a very converting religion, right? They were very proselytizing, just like that. It wasn't something new that was done by the apostles. This was a standard practice of Judaism was proselytizing, right? And you can see that in the Acts. I just read it, as a matter of fact. And it was talking about the Jews from all over the world were coming into Jerusalem, and then the apostles were preaching to them in the temple, right? And then they mentioned specifically some Greek Jews were in that, right? So they were already there, and they mentioned Greek Jews. There was a difference between Hebrews and Greek Jews. So there was the converts. They knew that people had converted at the time, and they were Greeks. Now, over hundreds of years, that becomes Jews. They're not biologically related to the Judeans, right? No more than, you or I are, or anybody else in the world, right? That's the thing. That's the reality of what's going on. So what he's getting at to here, or Black Knight was getting at to, to me, it doesn't even make sense. I don't know what the point is, really. I mean, it doesn't really hold water to me. It's like, okay, so we know this, right? There was lots of it going on. And there was a couple of other kingdoms that occurred. I mean, you had, there was a kingdom in Yemen that became Jewish. They converted, they were Jewish, and they were the Yemens and the Yemenites. There were other kingdoms that all over the place. Everybody focuses on Khazaria. Well, Khazaria is just one of many kingdoms that were, either majority Jewish or changed to Jewish or things like that. So, I don't know. I don't know what the point is. And just wait until the world finds out. What does that have to do with Woodrow Wilson and, you know, anything? Doesn't have to do anything with Woodrow Wilson. So I'm not sure what that is. Okay. Wake up world. Okay. So there we go. So my reply to him, everybody can go out here and read it, but basically it's, no, it's a lot more complex than that. The systems are in place, right? Means, motive, and opportunity. And I'm kind of hoping he would give me some evidence there because, bring it out there, right? A lot of it's Rockefeller's. We can prove Rockefeller network. We have the documentation from Rockefeller, his own words. This is it. It's a cohesive organization with a structure. They have the means, they have the motive, they have the opportunity. And they demonstrate it over time, right? So that's a clear one. Alfred Milner, Cecil Rhodes Network, clear motive. They announce it, and the organization's been built up with a lot of means to be able to take advantage of the opportunities over time. MMO, we have that. If you say the Jews, which Jews, right? There's as many Jewish denominations, so to speak, as there are Christian. They don't call them denominations, but it's denominations. I mean, even Reform, right? There's no central rabbi, right? Everybody laughs because they say, well, guess what? The Ashkenazic rabbi or the Sephardic rabbi, because there's two in Israel, the chief rabbi, they have a Sephardic and they have an Ashkenazic of Israel. They say, well, he issued this ruling. Who's that guy to me? It doesn't matter, right? In other words, your neighborhood rabbi is your guy, unless you're in a Hasidus group, like the Satmars or the Bobachers or the Chabadans. They have a central rabbi. In fact, Chabad doesn't have a central rabbi anymore. When Menachem Schneerson passed away in 92, blessed memory, he went away. And that they haven't had a rabbi since then. There's no central control of Chabad. It's committee, it's organizations. They even had an inter-scene fight because they had a bunch of teenagers come over from Israel, take over the basement. And, the PR fallout from that's been insane. But it was actually Chabad, the business organization of Chabad, that called the cops on the teenagers that had basically taken over the basement and were going crazy in the tunnels. Right. So even though it's a conspiracy, no, it was like they tried to get him out for, my understanding was actually a couple months, and they finally had to call the police, and it turned into that, fiasco public affairs wise, because everybody's like the Jews, like, what? No, it's literally one Jewish group getting angry at the other Jewish group because they're being stupid teenagers in the basement. Right. That's the issue here. Right. So which Jews? If he doesn't identify them, that doesn't help. Right. It's like saying the Italians. Well, who? Right? You've got Italians of different, the Americans, which ones, which agency, which political party, what are we talking? We need to talk organizations. Organizational structure dictates outcome. And if you can't show an organizational structure, you don't have a case, right? And that's the bottom line here. Show me the organizational structure you're talking about, or you're alleging that is responsible for this. And when you say the Jews, there's no organizational structure there, right? It's not like the Catholic Church or the Mormon Church that has an actual hierarchy. Right? Those have hierarchy, right? There's a guy in charge, or 12 groups in charge of the Mormons. The Catholic Church has a pope, right? And even then they have schismatics, right? They have the SSPX right now that started in France. It's all over the place. And they're kind of insinuating they don't recognize the pope, right? So there's a little rebellion going on there. So if they do something, does that represent all Catholics? Does that represent Christians? No, right? Show me the organizational lines. Show me that link network. Show me who's responsible. And then start to accuse. Then say, okay, here's the means, motive, and opportunity, but we need to see the organizational network first, not the Jews, this cousin, that cousin, especially when it's easily blown away, right? It doesn't make sense. So Wilson was a captured asset. Yeah, I agree with him. Going back to Wilson. So finally, we get back on subject here. He goes back to Wilson. Yep. Okay. Much like Trump today. Yep. Yeah. So presidents are instilled, and they're at behest of foreigners, but it isn't alien actors. See, this is a problem. Sometimes people think everything is outside. The enemy's outside. Sometimes it's like Pogo. If you remember that old, there used to be an old comic strip, Pogo. And he says, I have met the enemy and he is us. Right. And to get inside the immune system, right? Sometimes you're not sick from something in the environment, right? You're sick inside. And we have enough inside. We have clear lines that it's taken over the inside. It's easier to take over a nation from the inside than from the outside many times, right? Because the immune system of a nation will go to work. Right. But we have autoimmune disease in the United States, right? We were hit from the inside. We kept looking to the outside for half of our problems, but a lot of the measures that we're looking at came from the inside. And this is clear again with organizations such as the Rockefellers. It's one of many, but that was a big one that was moving things, right? For example, everybody looked at Margaret Sanger, right? Margaret Sanger was funded by the Rockefellers, promoted by the Rockefellers. Without her, she'd have been a nobody. She'd have been still, one little neighborhood clinic, right? Promoting her views and ideas. And there were people promoting the same thing before Margaret Sanger. It didn't start with Margaret Sanger. Eugenics, genetics, birth control, population control, that predated Margaret Sanger, right? They just used her. And then if you read her story, she was very much just a puppet. And she was becoming very frustrated because she was getting overrun by, she called it the men in the room, right? Because they would come in and the eugenics guys were taking over the whole birth control thing. So, I really don't understand what he's talking about with that. That's kind of odd to me. So let's go forward a little bit on this one. So international alien actors. No, I don't need that. Now, this is interesting. So alien Louis Brandeis. Louis Brandeis is American, right? So he's American, but he's also a Zionist, right? He's not, the Jews. Here's the thing you're going to have to realize. Let me remove this real quick. Okay, so here we go. Here's another good book I would highly recommend for everyone, right? So get this one, Shlomo Sands. This comes from a secular. So if you're looking for any religious-based, I wouldn't do it. This is just strictly him. He was trained, he was in Tel Aviv University, and he was trained on the Western historical. So to study Western nations is how he was trained in what he called Wissenschaft, right? So basically truth sciences within a historical context. In the Western sciences. That's how he was trained. And then he realized there were documents about certain things. So he walked over, which is a separate department in Tel Aviv University and all Israeli universities. The Western history or everybody else's history is over here. And then Israeli history is separate. The two don't mix. So he walked across campus and said, hey, do you guys have these documents? And they're like, yeah, no, those don't exist, but we can't publish that. They'll lose their jobs. So he's like, well, fine. I'm not under your system. I'm going to publish it. So he publishes this. Which comes from as if he was examining Botswana or, Thailand or America or Canada. He gets that, except he does it with Jews in Israel, right? So that's a big one. I definitely get that. But again, if you're religious, probably, I warn against it to some degree, because the problems with Christians, if you hit some of the Jewish foundation, it hits the Christians, right? It hits their faith-based system. For some Christians, others it wouldn't matter, right? Because they're like, well, we've got our system. So this is the one I'm talking about. So Louis Brandeis is an enemy. He's an evil guy to a lot of Jews, right? Because there was a huge group of Jews. The original opponents of Zionism were Jews from the beginning. Jews were opposed to Zionism. Zionism is a British Presbyterian group that the Alfred Milner Cecil Rhodes clique kind of said, hey, that's a good idea because it protects the routes and resources for the Suez Canal. It also gets a lot of the Jews out of Britain, right? And they saw it as a way of getting the Jews out of Europe. So Britain would be hailed as saviors. And for some reason, the British thought that, well, you just put the Jews back in a sandbox and they'll be happy, right? Israelis are miserable. Many Israelis, it's a hellscape over there. The younger kids are leaving. I mean, if you go to the ghettos of Tel Aviv, they're like, I'm out. And they go, most of them are going to Germany, which is interesting, right? So their grandparents are really kvetching over that, but they're like, dude, this is ridiculous. So they're getting out of there because it's not, their genetics are from elsewhere, right? Their culture's from elsewhere. They were raised in an environment that's elsewhere, right? And so, but Britain thought, if I put this back in the box, then they'll be happy, right? Not that they never came from the box, right? That the cultural that they've grown up with for 1,000 years has been in Europe, right? That's the issue. But Britain had these crazy ideas and they did it. So Britain created the idea of Zionism. And we can see that clearly in a couple of translated books from Theodor Herzl himself, right? This is the Judenstaat, the Jewish state. This is the translation of it, but you can read the original of this one. And basically when you go through here, you will see that it is a British company founded with the Brits, banking in Britain. Everything goes through Britain, and they transfer all the Jewish property of all the European Jews to Britain. Then they'll give them like carbon credits. They'll give them, settlement credits. They go to, at that time they call it Palestine. They go to Palestine, which is now Israel. And then the British would give them credits for a house or whatever. But then the assets in Europe, all these assets that they built up in Europe, the British own, right? So Germany, all of like Albert Ballin and his millions and billions of marks in the Hamburg America shipping line, all those assets and his, building the shipyards and all of that, that's now in British hands. Yeah, how clever. That's what they wanted to do. And the British could not understand why nobody was going to this, right? Nobody went to this, right? Before World War II, before Hitler, I mean, you get a couple of starry-eyed socialists that would show up and do this because they want to live in like commune environments. But out of like 30,000 in one of the Ileas, only 12,000 stayed. Right, everybody else left. Right. In other words, this just didn't work. But he shows it's clearly a colonial project by the British using Jews. But then he was an atheist. He really wasn't even Jewish if you consider the religion, right? The belief in God, and that Moses was given the laws at Mount Sinai, and we have to follow those laws. He didn't believe that, so he's not Jewish, right? If you think technical, if you go by the old mystical sense that your mom was Jewish, okay, so he's Jewish, right? But realistically, your mom doesn't give you any genetics that creates a religion in you. That's show me that chromosome doesn't exist. So that's the issue here, is that the British were setting this up, and you can read it in his own words, and this is his business plan that's in there. That's what this was. The second thing was he writes in here about why to do it, and then who kind of went in there, and it was a British guy, was his name Kingsman. He gives him a fictitious name, Kingsman, but it was one of Oliphant's group was coming in there. And he creates this Zionism, but the Jews are against it, right? Because the Jews realize if you're a religious Jew, number one, and this is in the old days. Now they've kind of changed it, but if you look at 1800, early 1900, before World War II, if you are a religious Jew, you are in spiritual exile. You're in exile because you broke all the laws, right? In other words, the ancestors broke the laws. You're in exile. The judge, who is God, will commute your sentence, and then you can go back, but not until the judge commutes it, right? What Theodore Herzl and his group was saying is that we're going to be God. We're going to tell the judge, now you're going back, right? But that doesn't work. So there was a huge group here. It's the Jews against Zionism. Brandeis was seen as an enemy against Jews, right? Because Brandeis was pushing the Zionist and the Jews, the Reformed Jews. So the religious Jews are saying it based on biblical text alone, right? The Messiah comes first. There's peace in the world. Then the Messiah brings the Jews back to Israel. Then the temple's built, right? That's the order of events. But the Presbyterians wanted to force the cart before the horse. And they said, you know what, forget God's judgment. We're going to build it. We're going to put it there, and that'll force the issue. Right. In other words, that's never a good idea, right? never a good idea, so that's the religious Orthodox version, but they don't talk much outside of Orthodox groups. In fact, only recently they've started going out because they recognize that there's an existential threat to Judaism because of Zionism, right? Zionism's put a big target in the back of Jews all over the world, as everybody knew it would, right? Now it's reaching that point. But there was a point before that in America where Reformed Jews, who were predominantly German Jews that immigrated over to America, normally not during the Holocaust, but some did, but many didn't. Many had been here since 1850, right? The 1848 various revolutions in Europe caused a lot of the German-speaking Jews to move over to America. And they were actually formative in the early Republican Party with Abraham Lincoln. They were formative, the Germans and the German Jews are formative in a lot of the abolitionist movement in the United States, because they were very much focused on that. So it was a huge mover, and they've been in America for a long time. And they were kind of what nowadays you'd call these modern conservatives, right? Modern conservative Jews versus Reformed Jews. Reformed Jews now are, I don't know, very strange. It's all over the place. But basically, that's what we're looking at here, is that they were very much against, see if I can find the passage here. They were very much against Zionism, and they were very outspoken about it. But the problem was guys like Brandeis and the other guy who was Stephen Wise, a very evil man, they were blocking them, right? And they had FDR's ear, right? So the Brandeis and Wise, Rabbi Wise, I hate to call him Rabbi, Schmuck Wise, they had FDR's ear, right? They were both puppets, and they had his ear. So in other words, to get those votes in for FDR, that voting block, they would have to do what they had a little bit of influence over FDR, but not a lot, because he would push him aside a lot of times. And just to show you on that one, everybody's like FDR was a puppet to the Jews. Oh no, if you have the inside letters, right? Basically, Wise was being used by FDR to keep the Jews quiet, keep them in their place, as they said, and to the extent that he was blocking a lot of rescue methods for the Holocaust. You could buy a Jewish family's way out of Nazi Germany or Nazi occupied areas in the beginning, right? They said, okay, give us some ambulances, give us some of that, and then we'll get this family out of here, right? And he blocked a lot of those efforts, right? He blocked it. He blocked a big effort from the Japanese that said, we'll take all of the Jews, all the stateless Jews over here that were created,
we'll take all of them in Manchuria. And they went to Stephen Wise because they thought, well, he's FDR, America, Stephen Wise, all the bankers, they believed all that stuff. They said, well, let's talk to him and we'll get it done, right? And this will be a great thing to do, right? It's before the war, right? They didn't realize FDR is gunning for Japan. And so they were going to do that. And nope, it just didn't happen because Stephen Wise blocked it because he wanted to kill. He was a Zionist. He wanted to create this catastrophe that would then finally maybe force people to move more Jews and to have a Jewish state in Palestine, right? Because the British, once they had what they wanted, they didn't need it anymore, right? And they're like, okay, we got a whole bunch of Jews here, we're good to go. And then it proved a lot more contentious than the British thought. They thought it would be easy and the Jews would get along great with the Arabs. The problem is the Jews got along great with the Muslims, with the Arabs and the Arab Christians that are there, the Arab Muslims that are there. The Jews that had lived there for 1,000 years and more got along great with them. In fact, the first settlers from the Zionist project would live in houses of Palestinians. But that quickly changed because these starry-eyed socialists, right, who aren't really, I mean, they never went to shul. They didn't speak. They didn't have no idea about Torah. They would go there and they would settle. They were basically socialist settlers, and they would go there and then force their, Eastern European modes of socialism on this system. And it was horrible for the Jews that had been there forever. It was culturally, they were different. They were night and day differences. They weren't the same group at all. And that was the issue. But the British realized very quickly, well, I guess they're not all the same, right? They were like the commenter. They think Jews are all the same. No, it's like saying Christian. You can have all kind of Christians. You've got Korean Sun Myung Moon Christians. You've got, the guys, Catholics from Mexico. Even Catholics have a little different variations within them, right? So that's the difference. There's diversity and differences of opinion and completely different cultures. And again, there's religious and non-religious. In fact, I stopped calling non-religious Jews. It doesn't make any sense, right? They're kind of culturally Judaic. They imagine themselves, they're kind of cosplaying, but they're not Jews, right? Unless you believe in the Torah, unless you believe that there's a God, you're not Jewish. It's the same as you're calling yourself a Christian. You don't believe in Christ. It doesn't make any sense, right? Voltaire kind of painted them into a corner with this whole race thing, but it doesn't exist. But anyway, going back, Brandeis, as the commenter said, Brandeis had FDR. Well, Brandeis had a little bit, but as Brandeis was a Zionist, he wasn't a Jew. The Jews of America, the Reform Jews, right? So 30 to 48,000, depending on, in this association, depending on the year. At one time, I got, I think, 60,000, 70,000. And there weren't that many Jews in America. Remember that. In this association. This is just the association. This is a political association opposed to Zionism, right? In fact, the German Reform, Theodor Herzl was going to have the first Zionist conference in Germany. It was boycotted. All of the rabbis in Germany were like, heck no. That's why the first Zionist Congress had to be in Switzerland, because the Germans were like, no. The German Jews were like, get the heck out of here. Zionism is opposed to, antithetical to Judaism, right? And it was. So this is an excellent book. I would highly recommend it. It goes through 1942 to 48. By 47, 48, it was a done deal. So they dissolved the American Council for Judaism, but it shows the politics. It shows the absolute fight that was going on between the Jews that were against Zionism and not getting any airtime, right? Because political guys like him and like Brandeis were doing whatever FDR wanted. And what would FDR want? Whatever the heck the oligarchs want, to get more money. But the Jews are just tools in that. They're not fomenting it. They're not moving the ball, right? That's the difference. Yeah, there's a Jewish name out there, but who's behind him? Who's behind him? Who's behind him? Who's moving the ball? Where's the motive? The motive is not for an Israel. The Jews didn't have a motive for Judea, for Israel. They had a redemption in the final time, but some of them, like the Reform, they didn't even believe that was going to happen. They thought it was metaphorical, right? It's a promise of something to come, and we're Americans now, right? So we make the world better. That's their opinion, right? So, I mean, it doesn't make sense. Every group has it. So for someone to say that is a central theme, and that's why it happens, that doesn't work at all. So let's go back over to here. All right, we're almost here. So Louis Brandeis, Bernard Baruch, okay. And he conflates Louis Brandeis with banksters of Europe. I mean, he's not part of that, right? He was a political guy with FDR along with Rabbi Wise, and we've shown they're not Jewish, so that doesn't match. We also have the Federal Reserve Act. Okay, so he's correct here, but again, he assigns it to a Jewish conspiracy. The Federal Reserve had been promoted before. There'd always been promotion for a central bank, right? A central bank or a national bank was always in there. I mean, Jefferson was, look back at Thomas Jefferson, right? For crying out loud. So that process has always been in there, but everybody understood that once you put that in there, it's a bad thing. And it comes down to statists versus individualists. If you're a statist and you believe everything is within the state and I'm not really here to protect the people, then okay, then you want a central bank, right? You want what became the Fed. That's your idea, right? In other words, we own the people. The people don't own this system. Then you're going to want a Fed, but that's been around long before. So, and it wasn't just the like read. There's a good one, Griffin, Jekyll Island. That's a good start to get involved in looking at that evolution of thought and what was happening and why it was below the radar. And it had to be because if people knew what was going on, they'd be like, "Hey, we don't want this," including a lot of people that really matter. But anyway, Rockefeller does support, so he says that, and have since been with the banksters of London. They fight against, oligarchs will fight against each other, right? In other words, allies are only allies for a time. If you've ever studied organized crime in cities, occasionally they'll align and occasionally they start fighting each other, right? Over turf and over wars, especially in economic downturns, they'll go after each other. And they're only aligned if it's in their best interest. So for groups to be aligned more than 100 years or 200 years, not so much. I mean, they'll fight behind the scenes, sometimes in front of everybody. But Rockefeller Foundation works for Rockefeller Foundation. And the moment that the city of London isn't beneficial to it, it's going to fight it or it's going to ignore it. And they'll do things in their own interests, the same as City of London, right? That's the reality of the world. Everyone acts in their own interests. Humans, everybody, right? So, I don't know where he goes from this. The Dutch Reformed, which is a clear factoid deeper. And so he's, again, applying there's crypto Jews, which is always this, it's kind of an interesting one. It comes from Spain, and it was the conversos. There was a bunch of Spanish Jews that converted to Christianity once Christianity took over all of Spain. And then the other Jews were moved out of Spain, and their assets, they had a certain amount of time. They can only bring a certain amount of assets. So it was a wealth transfer. And basically because the Jews were very integrated in with a lot of the Islamic groups that were in southern Spain, the Sephardics culturally were closer to the Islamic culture than they were to the Christian culture. The Ashkenazics were closer to the Christian culture than they were to the Islamic culture, right? But they were up north in France and Germany. So anyway, with Spain, there were conversos, and they converted. And sometimes they would give the word crypto because they had traditions that were harken back to the Jewish traditions. And then they were seen as, they were regressing, they're reverting back. For example, when you do Shabbat, lighting candles on Friday night, that was seen as, they're going back to Judaism. If they would look out at stars on Saturday night, because that's when your Shabbat is over, right? So these are, and some of them are just cultural, right? In other words, the Catholic Church itself is very forgiving and very adaptable in its acceptance of culture, as long as you move it to God and Christ, right? In other words, within this structure that they have, it's there. In fact, there's Rogation Days coming up. Saturday is Rogation Day, with the Mass in this Saturday in the Catholic Church, especially the Roman Catholic tradition, the older tradition before during the Tridentine rites. There's Rogation Mass, and it's a much older ceremony that used to be in Rome, in the Roman area, for agriculture. In other words, they're praying that the crops aren't diseased, and it was their local agrarian god. And they had done that for hundreds of years. And the Roman Catholic Church had a choice. We can either squish it entirely, but that would create problems, right? In other words, they were looking at it, let's co-opt it, right? Let's move the dial, and we're going to replace it, and we're going to make the pilgrimage instead of the route where the old celebration was to this deity that they did on their festival. We're going to do it to these churches, and then it shows up at the Lateran, or the Basilica of the Lateran. Don't quote me on it. I'm still learning that, but basically that's the rule, right? So they adopted those in there. So they're very flexible, but because of the political nature within Spain, because it had been such a warring area, it was like Ukraine, right? They had been fighting for a couple hundred years between the Christian elements and the Islamic elements, and they had been fighting. And sometimes they allied. Sometimes, like El Cid actually fought for some of the Islamic kings and princes against the Christians at time, but he's seen as a Christian hero. It's just the nature of the politics. And so, after 200 years, imagine Ukraine, right? You get some hard feelings, right? It's going to be baked in there. And so within Spain, it's more baked in there. It's not necessarily an outgrowth of the church, because the church was very adopting, allowing of some other cultures to be able to maintain some of their culture, as long as it's going toward Christ as the savior versus anything else. But the conversos were seen as suspect in some areas, and they were called crypto Jews. In other words, even their descendants that didn't grow up, didn't learn Torah, they were seen as crypto Jews. So if they did anything wrong, they're crypto Jews. They were hiding among the Christians, like wolves in sheep clothing, I think was one of the terms used. So I think he's referring here to that. That suddenly Dutch reformers are part of Judaism. And that became kind of a myth everywhere because nobody wants to look at their family and go, yeah, we got some problems here. We got some skeletons in our closet because all human beings are capable of great good and great evil. All human beings. We're going to blame these other guys, right? Even with no evidence, we're going to blame these other guys. Now, do the other guys do wrong? Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, look at freaking Epstein. Right now, Epstein wasn't even Jewish. There's no mezuzahs on his door anyway. I've looked at every single photograph that they released initially before they scrubbed it again on his house. I was looking specifically at his apartment, and I was looking for what are the symbols that he puts, what's the artwork that he has, what are the artworks arranged, what are the books on his shelves, how does he do his layout of space and furniture and colors. Yeah, I'm wanting to get into that aesthetic. What's in his mindset, right? Because in certain groups and certain religions, they will decorate a certain way. They actually will reflect their mindset in their external environment. And one of the things that really stood out, if you looked at his New York apartment and the photos they released, there is not one mezuzah on the door. He's got a crucifix in there, right? But it's not in a place that's of reverence. It's just it's like on a mantle. Here you go. But nothing else. There's no Virgin Marys. There's no nothing else. So I think it's just there. And he had some Buddhist stuff in there. He had some Hindu items in there. But he had no mezuzahs, right? And if you're Jewish, you're going to have a mezuzah on the door, right? Multiple doors in your house, not just the entrance, but all the doors in your house. And he doesn't have it, right? So he's not, in his mind, he's not Jewish, right? He doesn't believe in Torah. He'll use the word goy, but I mean, white rappers use the N word. So it doesn't mean anything. So looking though at the bad stuff, there are bad people in all groups, but looking at everyone as being a crypto, that tells me he's not really looking at evidence, or it doesn't seem like he's looking at evidence. All right, moving forward, all the events I allude to come from the ideology of the middle and late 19th century set forth by Herzl. All right, no, Herzl didn't set forth, as we said, Herzl actually was listening to the British, right? The British dispensationalists, right? So this was created by Dalrymple. This was propagated by Oliphant. And it was a group of Presbyterians, both in Scotland and England, that kind of had this idea because they thought they were a 10th tribe. And they thought the other groups were corrupted. It was really weird. It's very, very cult. It's doomsday-ish, because they want to move forward the needle on the end times. And they believed if you force the issue, then God will react. That means you don't really believe God's in charge, right? Because you're in charge of God. That's their mindset. And then if you look at, people like Paula White, well, it's kind of there, and they're the inheritors of that craziness. So it's not Herzl. Herzl was a secular guy. He was overeducated, underemployed. He was hanging out in, odd jobs. He was like a reporter, and he could never maintain the status he believed he was entitled to. And he was very depressed and despondent. He didn't like the anti-Semitism because he saw it in France, and he overreacted to it. He was just really affected by it, even though he had never experienced it in Vienna. He just couldn't wrap his head around it. And it was true in Vienna and Austro-Hungary. If you weren't Christian, you're not going to go into the royal courts or the government in some areas, right? You could do municipal, but you couldn't do the kingdom or the empire. And he was, unless you got a special dispensation, right? It wasn't really open to you, but everything else was, right? But he was really affected by that. He wrote about it. And initially his thought was that he was going to take all the Jews in Austro-Hungary. They were going to go to Vienna and do a big public conversion to Catholicism, and that would solve anti-Semitism. And then he thought, well, I'm going to go to Argentina, right? We're going to set up an agricultural colony in Argentina, start a new life, the Wild West, and that'll solve it, right? I won't have to deal with this. And then he was approached by the British, and the British convinced him that no, you need to do this, and this is the way to go in Israel. And he writes about that in Alt Neuland. It's a fictionalized account of his mental change, but it's a British Christian philosophy with Zionism, right? So again, what he's talking about, this ideology of the Middle Age and late 19th century set forth by her, that's not connected, right? There is not, that doesn't work. All right. Rockefeller support for Maoist financing. Yep. Also some social programs, most of that. Mao's handlers came from the Comintern, can be ascertained by more deep dive study. Okay, I know who they are, but okay, so what? Know who they are. As asserted, historical records have been largely censored. Which historical work? We know who they are, right? We have the letters between Stalin, right? Those are out there. The Stalin-Mao communiques are open. They're out there. The Chinese didn't want them out there, but Yeltsin thankfully just opened them up, and that was some of the first thing the researchers got to. So I don't know what he's insinuating doesn't make any sense, right? Mao was absolutely, all over the place. Whoever's going to give him power, he was on it. He even worked for a brief period of time for Japanese intelligence colonel, right? Because he thought if the Japanese took over, he could be like Vidkun Quisling and be kind of the puppet ruler of China. He was okay with that, right? He was all over the place. He used the CCP ideology as just a mechanism by which he could get power, right? Because that provided him that kind of amoral system that he could thrive in, right? That was him, because he was just this, again, an overeducated, underemployed dude that didn't adapt well to modernity, and he wanted to kind of control it, and he was very malleable. So people around him were able to kind of move him in that way if they had power, and he viewed Stalin as having that power. Mao, never until Stalin died, Mao was always under Stalin's thumb. He was still fearful of Stalin and would respond to Stalin's maneuvers, right? And Stalin could put whoever was in charge of him, but it was Stalin at the head of this thing, right? We are very clear about that. Stalin had internal political things with the Politburo, small politics, but they didn't bother him for long because he would wipe him out. Stalin was all about the purges, right? So if anybody tried to get a hold of Stalin and move him, he was moving their needle 6 feet under the ground. It's just the way it was. So again, looking at the organizational structure of the historical record, that doesn't make any sense, right? Insinuating the Jews controlled Mao, that does not make sense in any universe. So there we go. And again, unbroken pattern since 2 BC. So now he's trying to move it in here with that. Again, it doesn't matter. There's no linkage, right? It's just ridiculous. All right. Last paragraph makes my point. Motive is world domination. Okay. Well, that's the motive, but the means of the control banking finance industry. Yeah. Okay. Patrol. Yep. Okay. So that's that. But so he's saying, okay, he agrees with the means, he agrees with the motive, but the means, but again, you haven't proven that means was held by the Jews. Okay. Which group of Jews? Show me the group of Jews. Show me how they manage the means. They don't, right? It just doesn't work. So he says granular research incomplete. Okay. So, okay. 3 decades in the shadow. Okay. Well, put your point out here. I mean, show the evidence, show the linkages. And again, maybe something I missed, but looking at looking at what he's insinuating, which is okay, or cryptically, I think he phrased it as, it doesn't make sense. And then he goes back to this issue, and when this is a biblical thing, right? This is religious, right? So some people believe that there's some kind of lineage or holy move between Israel, Judea, and modern Jews, right? There's some lineage. It doesn't, right? That doesn't link up in the fact-based world, right? There is no genetic linkage. Very few Jews today in the world are linked to Judeans, and probably only the Samaritans and people that are now Muslim living in that area or Christian living in that area, they're genetically linked back to Israel, right? There were 2 separate kingdoms, right? There is very little evidence that Judea and Israel were ever one big Israel, right? We don't have that linkage yet. It may be there, it may show up, but there is very little. They were aligned at one time, but Israel was the far more prosperous northern nation. Judea was kind of like the impoverished south until Israel fell, and then Judea kind of began to get wealthy, and then they incorporated a lot of Israeli refugees into their society, and then they kind of grew. And they incorporated a lot of the belief systems from northern Israel into their belief system, and that's what we can prove, right? Now, is it outside the realm that God would have done that? No, not at all. Right. Again, the famous maxim, he works in mysterious ways. It is wholly within that he may do that. But as far as looking at what is controlling things now, what is responsible for a lot of these things, it doesn't change the fact that what he's blaming Wilson for is the Jews controlled Wilson and the Jews kept us in World War I. No, it just doesn't bear the fact pattern. Britain had a vested interest, means, motive, opportunity. They broadcast it, right? Cecil Rhodes, not a Jew, a Christian, broadcast out exactly what he wanted to do. Alfred Milner was very open about it. The documentation is very there. Sykes-Picot, there wasn't a Jew on the Sykes-Picot agreements, right? Rothschild is a bagman. And oh, by the way, the British Rothschild family was fighting against the Austro-Hungarian Rothschild family. And they were fighting against Max Warburg, who was, as I said, the Kaiser Wilhelm II's personal friend, personal banker, and the Secretary of Treasury, the Treasury Minister for Imperial Germany. And when Max Warburg came to America and he wanted a loan from his brother was like, nope, not going to do it. Right? He couldn't even get a loan from his brother. Right? You can't even get a Jewish conspiracy between 2 brothers. They can't even conspire to give another guy a war loan in Germany from America. Yeah. How are you supposed to do anything else? Right? It doesn't make sense. It doesn't pass the smell test. So that's pretty much what I wanted to talk about today. Getting into that. And Henry Morgenthau, let's see. Yep, Henry Morgenthau Jr. So Morgenthau Jr. is a key. Now, he was neighbors with Roosevelt. So Henry Morgenthau Jr. was neighbors with Roosevelt. He was actually at the wedding when Roosevelt married Eleanor. And he was part of that and he was financing. But remember, Morgenthau was also directed heavily by both the Rockefellers and JP Morgan, right? So he was the Treasury Secretary. He was the liaison between Rockefeller, JP Morgan, and the White House, right? So Morgenthau was the guy that had the key to that. But occasionally, if you look at Morgenthau's notes, and there's a great online online. Let me get that for you. Actually, that's a great one. Hang on just a second. Haha. This is a good question. By the way, Stephen, thank you for that question. That's excellent. I should have saw that before. There's an online version of the Morgenthau's papers, and you'll see a couple things in there. Number one, he does as best as he can, but occasionally FDR will give him a curveball, right? FDR was famous for curveballs, and he would give him a curveball on something that he had to do, right? I was like, wait a minute, what? But FDR was working directly with feds. FDR had about 30, I want to say 26 or 36. I'll look it up here in a minute. He was as a CEO of corporations between the wars. So Secretary of the Navy in the First World War. Then he got out. He was a Wall Street insider. That dude was all in Wall Street. I mean, people think that FDR was some outsider. They thought Hoover was the guy on the inside of Wall Street and the big business and banking. No, Wilson swam at 120 Broadway. I mean, he literally was in the middle of Wall Street. He was sitting on, as I said, 26 and 36 corporations, either a CEO or controlling interest on the board or, on the board. They would set up all kind of front organizations. This guy he had his finger in almost everything. The one that interested me was the American Zeppelin Company, right? In other words, they were doing tech transfers of Zeppelins from Germany to America, and they actually got it. And this is how Roosevelt kind of cut his teeth. He was still Secretary of the Navy. He still had his foot in the government door, but he was doing regulations that benefited a company that he was in by tech transfers as part of the reparations. In other words, Zeppelin technology was like future technology back in the day, especially right after World War I. And the United States was looking at a lot of this technology that Germany developed in World War I to transfer it over here. And they would do that through reparations. So you can pay in gold, you can pay in this, or you can pay in technology, right? Because they were pretty advanced back then and the U.S. was wanting it. So it wasn't Operation Paperclip. That stuff didn't start then. It was before that, well before that. So what Roosevelt did was Roosevelt actually facilitated the decision by the United States government while he was Secretary of the Navy in World War I to have this as reparations. In other words, this was critical for the United States. We need this. Navy was looking at blimps or Zeppelins, and they said, okay, this is it. So they ended up paying the patent donor for it, a German patent owner, like pennies on the dollar for that, his technology, intellectual property. And then it got transferred over here to a company that Roosevelt it was either the deputy, was it assistant CEO or CFO? Don't quote me on, but he was up there. And then he jumped out and he went up to the top. Right. So in other words, he benefited himself. So this kind of corruption in government and that revolving door of government and private, that didn't start recently. I mean, I used to think so until I started studying it. That thing has been baked in for a while. So he was very involved in Wall Street. He was very involved in that network of folks. And there's hundreds of them. I mean, it's not just one or two or three. When we say the Rockefeller Group, it's not just John David or his son or Nelson Rockefeller. It's a network, right? So the family is kind of at the top, but they have hundreds of companies, hundreds of front companies that are set up. Now it's probably thousands. But when we looked at stopped the clock in about 1975 when we were doing the research, it's hundreds of companies. And they branched out. I mean, people like Bill Gates' dad worked for him, was very much involved in their population reduction program, the eugenics and things. That's Gates, right? They were very involved in moving a lot of the investments in IBM. IBM, of course, gave Gates his boost up at Microsoft. Suddenly they called this kid that had been eating pizzas in a warehouse and, and, doing code on an Altair system. And then suddenly they say, okay, you can make the operating system, and he doesn't even have it. That to me is a little suspicious, right? In other words, I've seen where big companies give other small groups legs up when they shouldn't, but because it's a form of nepotism, right? And so that's what goes on. So with Henry Morgenthau, absolutely right. He became Secretary of Treasury. He was big in with Roosevelt, but he wasn't a controlling node, right? He was a manager of the finances, which is super powerful, but he wasn't a controlling node because FDR, when you look at the letters between him and FDR, you can definitely see when he was like, okay, we'll go ahead and do this, or we'll do the other thing. So, but a good point, because that is a tremendous source of a lot of documents and a lot of knowledge about that system. And another one is looking at him on the road to war with Japan, which is my primary focus, is that long road to war they were already economically attacking Japan, not just a boycott of oil, not just a reduction of oil, but they were looking at freezing of assets. They were looking at which of these chemical precursors were necessary for which industrial production and hitting them on it. He was part of the plan to go down to Indonesia, and America bought all of the oil from Indonesia, from Dutch in Indonesia. Dutch owned Indonesia, it was colony, but the Dutch in Indonesia, we bought all of their oil for a year because when we started squeezing Japan's oil, they were going to go down to Holland and initially buy it before they invaded it. They were like, well, we'll just buy it. And they couldn't because we bought all of it. There was nothing to buy. We didn't need it. We just bought it to keep it out of their hands. And the ironic part was we bought it from the Dutch, who at the time were under Nazi occupied. It was a Nazi occupied government. So we bought oil from essentially the Nazis to keep it out of the Japanese hands so that they would eventually have to go to war with us to try to get some breathing room, right? And we gave them just enough oil so they could move the military machines, but they couldn't move their factories, right? Their factories and their civilian infrastructure would fall out. They only had enough for a couple of campaigns, and that's it. It's like, and that's Morgenthau, right? And there was another guy, Harry Dexter White, that was very involved in that. Just a tremendous amount of financial acumen that they had moving the needle. Now, Harry Dexter White, I would have to say, is also he was definitely a Soviet agent of influence. So when Yeltsin opened up the archives in the Soviet Union during the collapse of the Soviet Union, Yeltsin was actually pretty good. He opened up everything. Putin unfortunately closed everything up, but there was a golden age there, and a lot of really good researchers ran into those archives really fast and looking at that information about Harry Dexter White being an agent of influence for the Soviets at the very high levels within the United States. It's there. The crazy part is McCarthy was crazy. He was a bit nuts, but he was right. And it was actually bigger than McCarthy had, right? It was bigger than what McCarthy thought. There was a tremendous amount of back and forth between the Soviet Union and America, especially in the FDR regime, but it was before that, right? Because the Americans had funded the Bolsheviks, right? It was a huge operation for the Americans to fund the Bolsheviks and to move it in there. So, but very good about Morgenthau. Let me there's going to be some noise here as I try to type in. I apologize. Let me see if I can find the, because I had it on my other computer or my laptop. It's on the speed dials. I have a number of archives on that one. But most of his documents are now in there, and his note taking was phenomenal. I mean, it's sad when we look at our stuff. Hang on just a second. Let's stop sharing this. All right, we'll go through here just a second. So I want to get this for you because it's a great one. Here we go. There we go. All right. Yeah, I'm gonna put this over here on the chat for you, Stephen, because it's great. And hopefully you'll see this. If you can hear it, I'm putting it in the chat. And it's through the FDR library, but that's Morgenthau's the collection, and they've scanned a lot of his diaries, his notes, and you'll see some of the pictures there. It's just phenomenal. So some of it's online, some of it you're going to have to travel to some of the archives. Most of those are in the East Coast, but they do sometimes they'll travel. They'll actually take it on expedition, they'll move it around. So depending where you're at, you may get a chance to go to the archives and actually sign in, as long as you get the National Archives central ID access, and you have to do that every year. But when they do these expeditions around, you can get access to it. And then you can actually see them in person. Otherwise, they have a lot online, but there's a lot that aren't online. But it's a great system to be able to go into because, like I said, he was the minutia of the stuff. Oh, it's not showing up here. Hang on a second. Get an investigator, but not a videographer. Okay, here we go. Morgenthau Project. There we go. All right, so going up here. So through the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library Museum, they have a lot of these are in there. Now, keep in mind, because it is, it's the National Archives, so it's separate than the Presidential Library. But this is actually pretty good because they've digitized a lot of Henry Morgenthau's papers, and not just the Holocaust Project, but they've got a number of them, and it works into his detailed notes. And the stuff before the war is very interesting. The interwar period is the one that I was very interested in. I haven't looked at all these, but he begins to look at the finances. He looks at, how do we do economic warfare against Japan, all of that sort of thing. And it's remarkably interesting, but he doesn't again, if you look at the relationship when he was writing about his meetings with FDR, he's not controlling FDR. The kind of the handlers for the FDR, the guys he listened to, he would actually balance his friends out. So he knew he was influenced in some ways, but he was balancing those relationships. It was a guy named Tommy Cochran. Felix Frankfurter was another one. Morgenthau, but he had Morgenthau working for him at Treasury. But Tommy Cochran and Felix Frankfurter were kind of the big guys that were kind of influential with directly with FDR. When they would go, they could walk right in and advise them, things of that nature. But they were more in line with, they were working with the Kuomintang. In fact, the registration, the Foreign Registration Act that we have in the United States right now, that's actually making the news a lot, that started under FDR. And it was ironic because he was starting up. You had to be a foreign agent if you register as a foreign agent. If you're in America and you're paying into like Madison Avenue for advertisements or anything like that, you have to register as a foreign agent if you're working for a foreign government. Yet his two guys, Tommy Cochran and Felix Frankfurter, they were working and they were making millions of dollars off of the Kuomintang Chinese, and they weren't reporting it. They didn't report to FARA, and they had access to the president. I mean, that's you can't buy that kind of access. I mean, they'd walk right into the president and say, hey, this is what we want. And they profited a lot. There was a lot of profiteering based on the support for the Kuomintang before and in the early phases of World War II. A lot of Americans got rich off of that, a couple of them. And that pattern is repeated, and it probably was there before. That's the earliest I found because it was so well documented. But again, Roosevelt would balance those people against each other a lot of times. So it's quite interesting to see. But yeah, good point. Really good point about that. In fact, I think these are just, they taken away some of the others. Looks like this is just the Holocaust stuff. Hang on. Okay, so these are just specific to the Holocaust. There's another branch. Let me find that one. I wonder if it's over at the FDR library. There's another one that I have on my bookmarks downstairs, like I said, and it's really good because it goes into just the all of his papers. It's really phenomenal. Let me see if I can find that. Ooh. Well, it would be interesting if they took it off. Now it's my turn for conspiracy theory. It's like they've taken it off. All right, I'm going to check the Hathi Trust here just a second, and we'll get to it. Actually, let me show you what I'm looking at here. Hang on a second. I'll share the screen. Maybe. I might be human. I might not be. Been accused. Well, it's not going to go into it. So unless you're at the University of California. Okay. So I would check around with it because he's got some of this stuff elsewhere. But check the National Archives, dig into the National Archives. They had it in there. I was using a lot of it for my research into the road to war. But they've got a lot of Morgenthau stuff. So again, from my perspective, Henry Morgenthau Jr., he was influential, was very much there. But he was kind of like Brandeis or whatever, but he was more of an FDR guy, right? He liked the state fascism, socialism, but that was in vogue. This is the part that surprised me. Most of the big Wall Streeters, most of these giant industrialists, they liked a form of socialism. They wanted state control because they would be on top. Right. In other words, if you're in the door first and you kind of shape the legislation, you don't have to worry about competition. Right. We imagine them as kind of free marketers. We imagine them as capitalists. We imagine that. But what they wanted was basically state socialism. They wanted their companies to be augmented, right, underwritten by the state so that they're guaranteed things, right? Bank bailouts, things like that. They wanted that soft cushion, but they didn't want competition. And the government was the mechanism for that. And they liked socialism. They liked a form of communism in a way, as long as they were at the top. They weren't getting their things nationalized. So as long as they were immune from nationalization, they were fine. And we see that trend today that continues on. So that's probably the biggest thing that most people, including myself, don't really realize is that a lot of the people at the top want a form of government control. They like that. They don't want it for themselves, but they want it for everybody else because it eliminates competition, right? They have a captive market and no competition. What a perfect business model. And so that's very, very interesting to me. Let me show you the book on that. Actually, let me share this since couldn't find that. Hang on one thing, and then I'll be done for today, unless there's any questions, because I got to go to work. Let's go. Nope. Extra camera. Hang on just a second. Here we go. This is a good one. As far as I've seen, I went through, as you can see, there's a lot of the, a lot of notes, because initially I'm like, wait a minute. And I was arguing against the book as much. But after I went to he points to source documents out there. He does it great. It was verified, right? So in other words, I go in there and verify, like, okay, well, he's true. The other thing he does that I like is he points the whole letter in there, right? Some people just cherry pick little phrases out of it. He puts the whole letter in there and he says, this is what it is. But this is a good one because it's all three of his work, and he takes from actually Carol Quigley, Professor Quigley's initial research, and then Anthony Sutton kind of merges it together with some others. But it takes that and he runs in 3 phases, and he's run 3 books together. So basically you're going to get the Bolshevik Revolution. You're going to get into FDR and the kind of the socialization, the socialized movement within America during the interwar period. So from World War I argue from World War I forward to about World War II and afterward, we were the first fascist state, and it was showing how FDR's New Deal was very much very much a communist type of thing. And then Wall Street and the rise of Hitler, how he was put in. And Hitler I knew independently. That was the one that kind of sold me on the book, because I knew the Bolsheviks and I knew the Hitler issue. And then that kind of lent credence to the rest of it, because he was correct on those two, which was interesting. In fact, he didn't go far enough into Hitler being kind of placed in there. Hitler was a stateless migrant. He had given up his Austrian citizenship in 1923. He didn't get it back until 1932 when he got German citizenship, and he was forced to by the party. They said, look, you really got to get your citizenship, otherwise you can't go up in the Reichstag. And he went to a place called Brunswick, and there all you had to do was be a member of the city council and be a representative that would go up to the party Congress, and then you would get your German citizenship. So the least amount of effort possible to get a German citizenship. And earlier they had offered him a police chief position in one of the cities, like back in the late 20s, and he refused it, right? That's just too much work. So, that's Hitler. In addition to being arrested for a male prostitute in Vienna. I mean, that was the guy, and he was on drugs. I mean, and he dodged the draft. I've got his book from the 16th Reserve Infantry Regiment. And, contrary to the History Channel's ridiculous documentaries, his unit, the people in his unit, right, their recollections, their diaries, everything, he saw one combat engagement at the very beginning, and then he was rear echelon, like way back in the regiment, talking to battalions. So he'd go from regiment to battalion. That was it. And he created this kind of John Kerry heroism, to make you look big. But the difference was the swift boat veterans of his day, of Hitler's day, pretty much ended up either in jail or disappeared or bought off, right, or suicided. So that was interesting. So again, the similar model, but there's a lot of money that went into paying for the Nazi Party to move up, and that money came from American control companies in Germany. The German control companies didn't give it; Americans did. In fact, one of the companies was an American CEO, and they donated to the party, right? And we're controlling their economy through the Dawes and the Young Plan, through the Bank of International Settlements, right? We control the German economy. America was not isolationist, but this is a good one because, like I said, he has receipts. He brings it in there, source documents. He'll print the whole letter, and he's done what we usually do over here is we print out all the names and we look at it. We look at the link networks and we try to find, okay, how much or who or how. He's done that hard work with graphics, which is really nice, right? So I would highly recommend this book. There's 120 Broadway, and we looked it up. We're like, yep. And he shows the network, right? It's not one guy. It's not one person. It's a network of folks that have a common interest, and they work in tandem toward a common goal, but they're all going to benefit in their own way, right? And if somebody doesn't, they don't. And they move around. I mean, a lot of these organizations and entities move around. A lot of it was with the Fed, right? Fed chairman and people working for the New York Fed, they pop in and out of different organizations at different times. It's a rotating door, right? It didn't start with Pfizer and the FDA. This has been baked in for decades, right? Nothing new under the sun. It's been there. But like I said, this is an excellent book. I would highly recommend this to kind of get you started with, okay, this is how the system is working, right? Wars look more like Kelly's Heroes than, anything else. You're not fighting for whatever. You're fighting for routes and resources, right? It's always been that way from World War I, World War II, and forward. It's been that way. Now, the danger is, and this is the final thing before I sign off for here. The danger is, well, there'll be 2 more things. The danger is what happens in America. One of the things that nobody talks about with Wilson is that a Coeco fountain pen? Yes. Oh, Tom, Okay, I'm going to just sidebar here. So yes, Coeco fountain pens. So I was telling everybody in the beginning, this is like my everyday field kit when I go out and do investigations. So I love fountain pens, right? So I have, kind of the fancier ones and all that sort of thing, but I just love, because I write a lot for investigations. I have to write all the time, and I don't put a lot in digital because I know how to hack digital. So I'm like, nah, I don't want that. But I have a series. I found that Coecos are the best for me, for my use. And this is the Coeco Sport. It comes in a little tin, and I put a bunch of them in there. And when you're doing the investigations and reports and things like that, you highlight in a different color, right? So the who, the what, the where, you kind of put those in there. And then they even have a highlighter. So there's a Coeco Sport highlighter that, I'm nerding out here, that goes into, and then they have the fluorescent little tabs that you put in there. So I can even highlight with a fountain pen. So I can even control the depth of the line with that. It's a broad tip to begin with, but you can go in there. It's pretty good cartridge length in these, but there's another one. I've tried it out and it works out pretty good. They actually have here it is. So this is a special one. So if you don't want the cartridges, like I've got this one, I got a big ink red ink because I use red a lot. There's actually a mechanical addendum you can buy to an accessory that you can put into this, and then that works. So I just fill from the inkwell, so it saves me money. And I can't bring an inkwell with me, so I'll usually have one of these. I'm out right now, but I'll have these as a spare just in case when I'm in the field. But at home, I'll just fill up from the inkwell, and there it goes. So I've got different colors in there, and then I just use one of their tins for this is when I have to highlight different pages in a big report. If I'm doing like criminal defense investigation or something, put these in for the different tabs of what information I need. But these will highlight from there. And then if it's a formal thing that I got to wear a suit, so there's the big metal ones, and these are the sports, but they're pretty nice. They're pretty hefty, made of aluminum. And then I like it. One's blue for legal documents that I have to sign, and the other's black. So that's pretty good. And I get the fine nibs on that. And it comes with a nice little leather case that you can carry with you in your pocket. And then you've got this to remind you it's there, because I'll forget. So take it out. But I'll do that. Yeah. So I'm a big fan of Coeco, made in Germany, super quality. And the other thing on this one I forgot. So I've got them in here, but if I have to go out with them, you can slide this little guy on it, just put them in your pocket, and there's a little pocket clip. So yeah, these are good. These got a lot of use. I've been all over the place with these, like Thailand, all that. So it's been hot environments. The ink goes pretty good if you get good ink from Coeco. I like those. On this one I just bought, I haven't opened it up yet. I got this actually for my granddaughter to do calligraphy on, but then her mom's like, don't let her take that to the house, because I was like, okay, fine. So we're gonna open it up and keep it here for her. But it's got a little calligraphy set. But again, it's the Coeco quality on that one. So yeah, Coeco Sport is my go-to on that for the models, because they're easy to pack up. I just put them in my bag, and I'm ready to go in the field and do whatever for investigative notes and looking at documents and things like that. So good question. Thank you, Tom. Do you what's your favorite Coeco? I'm like, ooh, don't tell me, because then I'll probably go buy it. So getting back to the historical side of it. So a couple things is, so we understand, I want you to understand the pattern, right? We talked a lot for the last 2 hours about this. Oh, man, it's been 2 hours. We talked a lot about this, but there's a pattern in the history of it, right? So it's routes and resources. We always fight for routes and resources. We have for a long time. We mask it in terms of democracy. We mask it in terms of, voting for this or that or the other thing. This is why you're fighting. But if you think about it, fighting for democracy because the other people didn't vote the way you did, we're going to go kill them. And in World War II, our biggest ally was Russia, Soviet Union. That's not a democracy. We're fighting Japan, who was a constitutional monarchy, right? They had a democracy. So we're aligned with the Soviet Union against, it doesn't make sense. So on examination, a lot of the rhetoric doesn't match the reality. And the reality is, okay, you're fighting for routes and resources, economics, to create whatever security you have on an economic and geographical space for your territory, right? That's the reality of it. And when Woodrow Wilson, as you saw, I don't know if you guys were here, but if you go to the article we did a couple of days ago, that's what we're talking about. The comment, one of the comments was in that article. We'll go over here. We talked about rhetoric versus reality, and what are the real goals of the war. One of the things was here. There we go. So the article was on when we were looking up, for example, the fracas between Pope Leo XIV and Donald Trump. The interesting part to me was that suddenly we have an issue where that wasn't the first, right? It was Benedict the 15th and Woodrow Wilson. And Benedict the 15th, he tried twice to broker a peace deal. And the first time was 1915 before the US came in, and the British said no. In fact, not just no, but they had France and Russia and their Commonwealth sign that they would not deal with the Vatican, right? The Vatican peace initiatives would not even be thought about, right? That was the secret London Treaty, 1915. And it's like, okay, so that meant that, there's a peace, and the Germans at that time were willing, the Austro-Hungarians and the Germans were willing to go back to the 1914 status quo ante, right? Everything was before 1914, all the territory goes right back. Everything's back to where it was, right? We've resolved the issues, right? This is far more than anybody wanted. And the British said no. So they really weren't about peace, right? They really weren't about, solving whatever. They had another goal. And when the Bolshevik Revolution took over, they were horrible, but one of the things they did that was somewhat beneficial was they released all of the secret documents the Tsar had with Britain. And among that was the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which showed that indeed the war was about carving up territories, mostly in the Ottoman Empire, so that Britain could have more control of the oil and the routes and resources. And France wanted a cut of it. And then Russia wanted a cut of it as well, but then Russia fell, right? So the Bolsheviks took over. So that was an issue. And then Wilson. So what was Wilson's involvement in this? Well, Wilson had been linking in with the British, and it was supposed to be economics, right? Because the war was supposed to be over fairly quickly. The British thought they had a great plan, 10 million Russians coming from the north, 2 million French coming in from the south through Belgium, and they're going to converge in Berlin. And this is over by Christmas while the British blockade, and they send a small expeditionary force. Good to go. Didn't work because a couple of old retired guys came out. One was Hindenburg, and they brought him out of retirement, and he smashed the Russians while they were invading Germany, marching on Königsberg, and it was in Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes, depending where, which one you want to call the battle. And they turned that invasion by multiple Russian armies into a retreat. And in short order, they're actually passing Warsaw. I mean, they pushed the Russians back Warsaw, and the Eastern Front went nuts. I mean, they were just pushing them back, and eventually the Russians collapsed. The Tsar collapsed because in part of those just massive defeats. And at the same time, Germany was holding up Austro-Hungary. So all of this was kind of going on. And then, so what's Wilson's deal in this? So Wilson was approached by the Pope. A letter was sent by the Pope to Wilson saying, "Hey, here's this. Why don't we go for peace? And here's a 7-point plan." Right? He releases a 7-point plan for a just and lasting peace. And Wilson writes him a spicy letter back that says, no, stern facts, right? So what was Wilson after? Because some of these were actually incorporated. Some of the 7-point plans of the Pope were actually incorporated in in Wilson's 14-point plan, or his 14 points initially. So what was that all about, right? Why did the war have to be prolonged years and millions of people for what? What was the deal? So I'd recommend go look at that article. There's a lot of source docs in there. Click the links so you can see the actual letter. But what we kind of look at is that's a good example of, okay, the rhetoric, what Wilson sold the war to the Congress over wasn't the real reason, right? What was the real reason? And you'll see him in his speeches change. And then really you see what was installed afterward is really what his goal was. So why he didn't want peace is because his real goals weren't being achieved. And it wasn't about democracy. It wasn't about making the sea lanes safe. It wasn't about any of that. If you stop the war, the sea lanes are safe, right? Why do you have to continue on with war for years to make sea lanes safe? It doesn't make sense, especially when Germans were going to give concessions. So that's part of it. But what happened was it's very simple. World War I was about routes and resources, right? Same thing. And at the end of it, there was a couple things set up. Number one was the Bank of International Settlements. So a linking of the federal bank, the U.S. Fed, along with other national banks that had been set up into a central system in Bern, Switzerland. And that was supposedly managing the reparation payments, massive amounts of wealth transfer and investments, wealth transfer from Germany into others. In other words, they're raiding. It's a legal way of raiding kind of the German treasury. And they were using that as a control mechanism, right? That was one. League of Nations was the other one. Now the U.S., because Wilson had a stroke and his wife and initially Colonel House, but his wife fired Colonel House, the wife and the physician that were taking care of pretending to be Woodrow Wilson while he was basically a vegetable in the White House. Arguably, Edith Wilson is the first female president for at least 2 years. And she was running the deal, but she couldn't get that through Congress. They couldn't go out and do all that sort of thing. So it failed in Congress. So the League of Nations failed in the U.S., but we were still very much involved in the economic movements that shaped Europe. In other words, the the scope of reparations payments, the Dawes and the Young plans were economic plans set up. And the third part that most people forget. So we have an economic control, which is the Bank of International Settlements. We have a legal mechanism of political control, which is or manipulation shaping, which is the League of Nations, right? And the third part that nobody talks about, which is evident in World War II, but it wasn't evident in World War I, is a domestic shaping. So Woodrow Wilson, just after signing Declaration of War, went after German Americans, which had been here for just decades. So 1840s, 1848, 1850, 1853 was the first wave of a lot of Germans because of the revolutions in Europe. A lot of the German speakers came over. They were very involved, as I said before, in forming of the Republican Party, getting that started or supporting it. It was already starting, but they supported it and they were making sure they were very strong abolitionists. And they fought, there was a couple of units that were full German. They were actually fighting in the Civil War on the side of the Union. And afterward, they were very large contributors to the university system in America, to the sciences. They were bringing German science over to America, right? That kind of Wissenschaft is what they call it. That discipline was coming to America, right? But it was also the ennobling of a labor class. And it was the kind of the way that you didn't have to be communist, but you didn't have to be an exploitive capitalist, but you had good wages, right? You could have good labor, good wages. And that fight that was going on very violently in America in the 1880s between labor and ownership or management, that was violent. I mean, huge. Haymarket riots was just a one example of many that was going on in the United States because of shrinking opportunities for of what had been a very vibrant economy. And America said, okay, we got to go overseas for networks. That's a whole other story, but that was the dynamic going on. But the German model, especially the one that was in the 1880s and 90s in Germany, the one that Britain hated, was you could have your cake and eat it too, right? There was a balance between labor and management, where management gets its profit, the owners get their profit, labor still gets good working wages and reduced exploitation without the need for kind of a socialism or Marxism, right? It was that way, but that made it a target. Just to show you, so in World War I, all males of German origin had to register. There were 2 concentration camps, believe it or not, set up in America. I was surprised at this. I knew about the Japanese internment camps. I didn't know about the ones in World War I, but there was 2 of them set up. One was in Utah, Salt Lake City, Utah, Fort Douglas. The other was in Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia, and they were interned, rounded up. Businesses were seized. There was even a college professor that was jailed because he was playing Beethoven. He wasn't German, but he was playing Beethoven. There was the Enemy Aliens Registration Act. There was a lot of new surveillance, a lot of new control was against Germans because they were seen as the enemy. Even if they had been here for generations, they were seen as the enemy. There was a tremendous amount of propaganda in the United States against the German enemy that grew up here. And German town names were there. There was actually Bismarck, North Dakota is actually a remnant. There were other Bismarcks, and there were large, ordinances to change the names. So a lot of these towns, the streets, the cities themselves, the names were changed and never back. So it was very interesting, the political move. And in some ways, he does make the case, I'm still working on it, but he does make the case that the prohibition that Wilson introduced was the temperance movement had always been there. They were there for different reasons, but the temperance movement was their reason, but the actual reason why Wilson supported it and went into it was because it then took away the economic ability of the German Americans to be able to have any type of economic leverage, right? So the big breweries were big business, and they were giving political contributions mostly to Republicans, right? And so Wilson's like, yeah, we're having none of that. And so it is a strong possibility. It's within the means and it's within the motive and the opportunity, but I have to find out for sure the means. There was huge book burning. German books were burned. University courses were gone. German language was gone. It went from about 400 German language newspapers with over 2 million readers down to about, I think it was 18 within a decade. So there was this massive focus on Germans as a domestic enemy. And this is World War I, right? And a lot of these Germans were Jews. And there was a tremendous amount of focus on that to destroy the German American culture, which really was American culture in many places, right? It was science, it was art, it was culture, it was opera, it was classical music, like I said, and they call it Burning Beethoven. It's an interesting book, short read. The companion to it, which goes even deeper into that whole period of time with Wilson and his domestic control, the ability to try to destroy the ability of groups to be cohesive and independent within America is American Midnight, right? And it goes into a pattern that you'll see a lot of in America. And so Wilson was part of that. There was a farmer that didn't buy war bonds. They tarred and feathered him. It's just these guys lynched a guy to death because even though he was kissing the American flag, and he's like, "Look, what are you talking about?" And they literally lynched him. They got off. But there was a tremendous amount of violence, but it was controlled violence by the government to begin to enact controls within the United States. So I would argue within World War I, based on this, the three main outcomes of World War I were destruction of an economic competitor, which is Germany. That was Britain's main focus. The United States wanted involvement within the BIS, Bank of International Settlements, to link our financial system with the emerging global financial system, and the establishment of League of Nations, which is a geopolitical control mechanism to shape international relationship in order to get economic advantage for your groups. That was World War I. Fast forward to World War II, considering also take in mind our earlier Road to War. Take a look at the video on that one. If you're on Facebook, it's actually pinned there. You'll be able to find it within the Substack if you go back. Misako Ganaha interviewed me, and this was on a project we had done for the Near East Center for Strategic Engagement. Are we ready against China? Looking at the history in the past, how ready were we in World War II? And surprisingly, very ready, which goes against the whole narrative. We had planned the war in 1907, trained on the war every single year, full-scale exercises since 1923. So if you're a lieutenant or an ensign coming into the Army or the Navy, every single year you train full-scale exercises against an adversary. And the final exercises and plans looked remarkably like the actual campaign in the Pacific, except for the addition of MacArthur's theater, because it was political. They didn't factor MacArthur in there, but he had his own little theater. But other than that, everything went up there, right? Admiral King it was like old home week for him, because he trained on this since he was an ensign, right? He knew it inside and out. We were the most well-trained military in probably history. That war is the most planned, the most trained on war in history, equipped war in history. It was amazingly efficient. But we needed to break into, if you look at it, we needed to break into the Asian market, and that's what it was all about. And so we engineered a lot of the conditions. We set the conditions which create the pressures to do that. And at the end of that war, what do we have? Well, the Japanese went through that, right? We had the Japanese. Now they were the targets. Before it was the Germans in World War I. Now it's the Japanese in World War II. The Japanese Americans. They go to internment camps. Their economics shift. The ability to be able to be cohesive within their own area and less susceptible to outside influence, that goes away, right? That culture goes away in the United States. And then the Sansei and the Yonsei have really never recovered from it. In fact, it's interesting. The Japanese will come here and they say that it's a different species. They're different because that culture has been kind of hit pretty hard. And then we broke the economic block that was Japan, and Japan was building with Pan-Asianism in Asia. And what do we get at the end of that war? They do the same thing here. At the end of the war, we have the World Bank. Now we have the United Nations, which is even stronger than the League of Nations, right? Which is the next evolution of it. And domestically, we have a number of surveillance programs, and we have a number of welfare programs increased, right? So in other words, it solidified the New Deal. It put a lot of things on emergency war powers and ensconced them. It grafted a lot more of the business and the government together, so much so that's what Eisenhower was talking about with this military industrial complex. But it didn't start just in World War II. The mechanism started before that in World War I and a little bit before that. 1880s, 1890s, they're theorizing how to do this and doing away with democracy, right? Transforming democracy to something else, a different name, but the mechanism is far from what's constitutionally outlined. So what is World War III about, right? You can look at pretty much the same thing. There's going to be an economic control system put in place. There's going to be a social control change at home to whatever group now is resistant to centralized control, that can maintain independent cohesiveness and independence. And then the third thing will be a new form of United Nations. United Nations isn't going to work, so we'll have some new system out there. And it'll probably be a lot with AI. I mean, if you look at how technology was implemented and that sort of thing, AI will be a big part of it. The connectivity, the databases, that's going to be a massive part of this type of thing. And now we're going into expanding markets with routes and resources. It's all routes and resources. Same thing that's been, fought for generations, nothing new under the sun. But that gives you an idea kind of where this goes through. And it takes a lot. It's not one guy, it's not one group, it's a whole bunch of people kind of network together believing that this thing is moving forward. Now there's some top dogs in there. You've got some visionary guys at the top that have access. But again, if they're operating, do they think they're evil? Probably many of them don't. Many of them think they're actually improving the lives. Many people that fought in World War II and World War One did so honestly, right? They were not aware of what they were actually fighting for or going for, right? They don't understand. As Michael says, you're a cog in a clock, you're a gear in a machine. You don't understand what you're doing, but I'm doing my job really good. This machine is moving forward. Okay. And this is the way it's always been throughout history. Most of the wars have been about economics. They just couch it in some other terms, but it really is about economics, because if it's not, you're going to go bankrupt pretty quick, and that war doesn't last very long. And that society won't last if it's bankrupt. So hopefully that helps. If there's any more questions, we'll go ahead and sign off for today. And oh my goodness, 2 hours. I'm already late. All right. So we'll make another article about that. Please go over to take a look at the article that we've got over there on the history of the Pope, the first Pope President Fracas, which was Wilson and Pope Benedict XV. It's good to look at also the Vatican's idea of the jus ad bellum, or the why a just peace. What is the reasons for war? What is a just war? And then some of the encyclicals that came out, so you can see what Wilson was rejecting and why he was trying to rephrase it, and then how he rephrased it. So all the links are there. We've got those things in there for what we talked about. Pretty much in the middle part of that is over here in the comment section. You got to kind of go down here to more comments. And then I'm going to write up a brief reply to his reply to Dark Knight, but pretty much we went over the thought process here, right? In other words, this doesn't make sense when you examine it based on means, motive, and opportunity, plus the network. You have to outline the network you're talking about and then see if it's got it. You can't just say the Italians did this. Well, which ones? which organization? Help me out there. So hopefully that answers everybody's questions. Everybody be safe out there. I do have to go. Thank you again for kind of stopping by and listening to this. We're going to try to do it every Thursday, but if I'm overseas or somewhere else in the United States, we'll try to change the time up, and I'll try to keep coming back here at least every Thursday if I can, permitting that. And if you need any private investigation services on the side, go ahead and take a look at Secure Point Investigations. Again, we're based in the Northwest, but we do operations all over the United States and globally through the Council of International Investigations. We can take a look at that. Thank you for hanging out with my hobby here with historical investigations and talking these issues. And if you have any suggestions or anything, please let us know. If you disagree with anything I said, absolutely bring me the evidence. I love it. Let's discuss. All right. You guys have a great night and be safe.